What's up, guys? Welcome to DC Harry. We've got something special today. Catwoman rescued Harry age 5 and Thief Queen's love taught him steal magic from Dumbledore's vault. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's dive in. Chapter 1, The Cupboard and the Cat. The cupboard under the stairs at number 4, Privet Drive, was exactly 31 inches wide and 62 inches long. Harry knew this because he'd measured it with his hands the way Selina had taught him later: span your fingers, count the lengths, always know your space. But at 5 years old he hadn't known that yet. At 5 years old he just knew it was small and dark and smelled like old shoes, and that the bolt on the outside was the kind that slid home with a sound like a full stop at the end of a sentence. He'd been in the cupboard since Tuesday. He thought it was Thursday now, but he wasn't entirely sure because the only light came from the gap under the door, and he'd slept twice and once the light had already been gone when he woke up, so maybe it was Friday. He had a plastic cup that Aunt Petunia had shoved through the door on Wednesday, and he'd been careful with the water, but it was gone now. There was half a bread roll that he was saving. He wasn't sure what he was saving it for. Some instinct that said not yet. He wasn't crying. He'd cried the first day and it hadn't done anything except make his head hurt and his eyes sticky, so he'd stopped. He was thinking instead. Thinking was something he'd always been good at, even if nobody at number 4 had ever noticed or cared. He was thinking about whether the bolt could be worked from inside if he had something thin enough to reach under the door, and he was thinking about the spider that lived in the high corner to his left whose web had caught something interesting this morning, and he was thinking about the dream he'd had: green light, a woman's voice, the sensation of falling upward, which wasn't a sensation that should exist but did, in dreams. Outside, beyond the cupboard door, beyond the hallway, beyond the front door with its brass knocker in the shape of a lion whose expression had always struck Harry as embarrassed rather than fierce, the street was quiet. It was late. Number 4 was asleep. The whole of Privet Drive was asleep, all those neat houses with their neat gardens and their neat families with their neat certainties about how the world was organized and who belonged where. Selina Kyle was not asleep. She was on a roof 3 streets over, and she was annoyed. The job, if you wanted to call it that, and she preferred acquisition, was supposed to have been clean. In and out of the Harrington estate, through the east-facing skylight that the security system inexplicably left on a 40-second rotation gap, lived the Vermeer that old Gerald Harrington had bought at a suspicious auction in Geneva in 1987 and which had spent the last 6 years in his private gallery being enjoyed by an audience of precisely one instead of being seen by anyone, and then out again before the patrol came around. Simple. Elegant. The kind of job she did to stay sharp when Gotham got boring. Except the skylight rotation wasn't 40 seconds. It was 34. She'd clocked it at 40 from the outside, but the internal mechanism was older than the external sensor and ran on a different rhythm, which she discovered at the exact moment the alarm started screaming. She'd gotten out. She always got out. But she'd had to go over the north fence and through someone's garden and then someone else's garden, moving fast and low through the manicured quiet of Surrey in a way that would have been deeply undignified if anyone had been there to see it, which they weren't, because it was 3 in the morning and even the neighborhood watch went to bed eventually. She'd come down off the last fence into Privet Drive and was recalibrating, pulling her mental map, deciding on her extraction route when she heard it. Not crying. She almost wished it was crying. Crying was loud and directional and explicable. This was something quieter and in some ways worse. A small knocking sound, rhythmic and patient, coming from inside the house directly to her left. Number 4. The kind of knocking that had stopped expecting an answer and was continuing purely as an act of occupation, something to do in the dark. Selina stood in the shadow of a hedge and listened. The knocking stopped. Then, very quietly, a child's voice said, to nobody, 62. It's 62. She should have kept walking. She knew she should have kept walking. The job was blown, she needed to be 3 miles away and heading for her hotel, and whatever was happening inside that neat little house with its embarrassed lion knocker was not her problem. She stood there for 4 more seconds. Then she went to the door. The lock was a standard Yale, she had it open in less time than it took to think about it, which was a mercy because if she'd had to think about it she might have made a better decision. The hallway was dark and smelled of artificial lemon and something that might have been cabbage. Everything was aggressively tidy. There were photographs on the wall, a broad man, a thin sharp-faced woman, a boy who looked like if a thumb had been given ambitions, but none of a second child. The knocking had started again. She followed it to the door under the stairs, and when she crouched down she could see the shadow of small fingers in the crack of light at the bottom. She found the bolt and slid it back. The door swung open and she was face to face with a small boy with dark hair sticking out at every angle and enormous green eyes that were examining her with an expression that was not frightened and not surprised and not desperate, but was instead the expression of someone who had done a calculation and was waiting to see if the answer was correct. "Hello," he said. "Hi," said Selina. He looked at her, at the dark suit, the goggles pushed up on her forehead, the gloves, with a calm, assessing gaze that she would later recognize as the look she saw in the mirror every morning. "Are you a burglar?" he said. "Not right now," she said. He seemed to accept this. "I'm Harry," he said. "I'm very thirsty." She looked at him, really looked. The too small clothes. The thin wrists. The way he held himself in the doorway of that tiny space with a kind of battered dignity that he absolutely should not have had at 5 years old, that most adults never developed at all. Something in her chest did something uncomfortable that she chose not to examine. "Come on," she said, and she stood up and went to the kitchen, and after a moment's hesitation he followed her. She found a glass, ran the tap, handed it to him. He drank the whole thing standing up, steadily, without gulping, and then held the glass back out to her with a polite gravity that was somehow the most heartbreaking thing she'd ever seen. "Thank you," he said. "When did you last eat?" "Wednesday. There's half a roll but I was saving it." "For what?" He thought about it. "I'm not sure," he said. "An emergency, I suppose." She stood in the tidy kitchen of number 4, Privet Drive, and looked at this small, calm, green-eyed child who'd been locked in a cupboard for 2 days saving half a bread roll for a worse emergency than the one he was already in, and she felt something harden in her chest like a decision that had been made before she'd been consulted. She opened the fridge. She found cheese and bread and leftover chicken and she made him a plate and he sat at the kitchen table and ate with careful, deliberate efficiency, not rushing, watching her the whole time with those enormous eyes. "Where are your parents?" she said. "Dead," he said. Not cruel, not dramatic. Just a fact he'd been given and learned to carry. "Car crash. When I was a baby." She sat down across from him. "And the people upstairs?" "Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia." "And Dudley?" A small pause. "They don't much like me." She looked at the door under the stairs, visible through the kitchen doorway. "I noticed." "They say I'm abnormal," he said, and something flickered briefly in his eyes, not hurt exactly, more like a scientist noting a data point that doesn't fit the model. "Things happen sometimes. When I'm frightened or angry. Strange things." "What kind of things?" "Once I was on the roof," he said. "I don't know how I got there. And once Dudley's friends were chasing me and I ended up on top of the chimney stack and I definitely didn't climb it." He ate a piece of chicken with the focused attention of someone who wasn't going to waste a single calorie. "Last month Aunt Petunia cut my hair very short and it grew back overnight. That's why I'm in the cupboard." Selina watched him. "That doesn't seem abnormal to me," she said. "That seems like a skill." He stopped chewing. He looked at her. And on his face was an expression that she'd seen precisely once in her life, in her own reflection, at 16, when someone had first told her that the thing she did that everyone else called problem was actually called talent, and it cracked her composure more thoroughly than any alarm system ever had. "Finish eating," she said. "You're coming with me." He tilted his head. "Are you kidnapping me? Do you want to stay?" He glanced at the cupboard door, visible from where he sat. He looked back at her. "No," he said. Not particularly. Then I'm rescuing you. There's a difference. What's the difference? She stood up and picked up her bag. In a kidnapping, the person doesn't want to come. How are your shoes? He looked down at his feet. The shoes were 2 sizes too large and held on with a doubled knot. They're Dudley's old ones, he said. They slip. We'll sort that. She held out her hand. He looked at it for one moment, that same calculating gaze, and then he took it, and she felt the small, bony pressure of his fingers against her gloved palm, and that was that. They left number 4, Privet Drive at 3:47 in the morning. Harry took nothing because there was nothing to take. He didn't look back at the house. Later she would realize that in 10 years of raising him she never once saw him look back at anything, which was sometimes a virtue and sometimes the kind of thing that kept her awake at 3 in the morning wondering what it had cost him to learn that. But that was later. Right now he was just a small boy walking fast beside her through the sleeping streets of Surrey with 2 sizes too large shoes and the end of a bread roll he'd brought from the cupboard, pressed carefully in his pocket, because old habits didn't dissolve overnight. She still had the Vermeer job to salvage. She still had a train to catch and a hotel room to vacate and a dozen logistical problems to solve before dawn. She also, apparently, had a child. Well, she thought. This is new. The next 4 years were Gotham. Not the tourist Gotham, not the skyline and sirens Gotham that showed up on the news. The real Gotham, the layered, practical, lived-in city that existed between the official version and the darkness, the city of fire escapes and late-night diners and 1,000 small economies that didn't show up in any tax record. Selina's Gotham. She knew every roof and every shortcut and every person worth knowing, and she was careful about which parts of it she let Harry see and in what order. He was, from the beginning, the most curious person she'd ever met. Not curious in the way that required constant stimulation or made a fuss when it didn't get answers. Curious in the quiet, methodical way of someone who had decided at some early point that understanding the world was a survival skill and had been pursuing it with steady, undramatic intensity ever since. He would sit for an hour watching a locksmith work. He would ask 3 precise questions about something, remember every answer, and never ask about it again because he'd absorbed it completely. He learned to read at a pace that alarmed his first-year teacher, who called Selina in for a meeting that Selina attended while wearing sunglasses and a hat and a complete fiction about being Harry's aunt that Harry backed up so smoothly the teacher never had cause to doubt it. He's exceptional, the teacher said. We'd like to put him in the accelerated program. He'd like that, Harry said, from beside Selina, and she kicked him gently under the table and he pressed his lips together and looked at the ceiling. She enrolled him in school under the name Harry Cole, which he accepted with the same practical gravity he'd accepted everything else, and she got him shoes that fit and clothes that were his, genuinely his, not hand-me-downs, and she watched him unfold slowly from the careful, contained child she'd found in the cupboard into something brighter and quicker and more complicated. He still didn't look back at things. But he'd started, tentatively and then more easily, to look at things. At her. At Gotham. At the world, with those green eyes that had always been sharper than they had any business being. She told him, when he was 7 and asked directly, that she was a thief. They were on a rooftop, she'd been teaching him rooftops, which she considered a fundamental life skill, and he'd been watching the city below with that quiet, attentive look, and then he'd said, without preamble, "You steal things. Don't you?" It wasn't quite a question. "Yes," she said. He thought about this. From who? People who have too much and got it wrong. That seems like a broad category. "I'm selective," she said. Another pause. The city turned below them, indifferent and glittering. "Do you think I could learn?" he said. She looked at him. 7 years old, skinny as a garden rake, hair like an explosion, wearing a jacket she'd bought him in a Goodwill on 4th Street that he'd been inexplicably delighted by. "You already are learning," she said. He looked at her. "The rooftops," she said. "The awareness. Reading a room when we walk into it. Knowing where the exits are. You do all of it naturally. But the actual, he made a gesture with his hand that was remarkably expressive. That comes later, she said. When your hands are bigger. He accepted this as reasonable, because he always accepted timelines as reasonable if the logic was sound. What she didn't tell him, then, was that he'd been picking locks since he was 6. She'd left a simple practice lock on the kitchen table one night, the kind she used to keep her own fingers nimble, and the next morning it was open and there was a small note beside it in his careful handwriting: "The third tumbler is looser than the others." Is that normal? She'd put the note in the drawer where she kept the things she wasn't going to think too hard about. The strange things kept happening. Not as frightening as they'd been on Privet Drive, or maybe they were, but Harry had learned to treat them as data points rather than crises, which was perhaps more frightening in a different way. A mug that fell off the counter and stopped an inch from the floor. A locked door in the library that opened when Harry said, quite conversationally, "Oh, come on." His hair, which defied every attempt to flatten it, and which Selina had stopped trying to manage when she realized it was responding to his moods and that somehow an emotionally aware haircut was just part of her life now. She asked around. Carefully, because Selina Kyle was always careful. She had contacts in places that didn't officially exist, and she knew that the world was considerably stranger and larger than most people's permission slips allowed for, and eventually someone in a bar in Budapest said the word magical in a context that was not a metaphor. Which was how, when Harry was 9, they ended up in Prague. The building was on a street that Selina's map said was a dead end, and which turned out not to be if you looked at it with the expectation that it wasn't. It was 4 stories of old stone, unremarkable on the outside, which Selina recognized as the signature of somewhere that had spent considerable effort making itself easy to overlook. Harry walked beside her with his hands in his jacket pockets and his eyes moving across the building's facade with the systematic attention she'd taught him. "Third floor window," he said. "That's a person, not a reflection. And the lamp above the door isn't electric." "Good," she said. "The street behind us has one person following us," he said. "They've been there since the corner. Shorter than me." She had already clocked all 3 of these things, but she let herself feel the warmth of knowing he had too. "What do you do about the follower?" "Nothing yet," he said. "They're not threatening. They're curious. Threatening people don't walk that loudly." She knocked on the door. It was opened by a woman who was either 60 or 600, her face deeply lined and her eyes sharp and dark and amused, wearing clothes that looked like she'd raided several different centuries' wardrobes and combined them with total confidence. She was shorter than Selina, which put her barely at Harry's shoulder, and she looked up at him the way you'd look at something very interesting you'd found while looking for something else entirely. "Mara Voss," said Selina. "Selina Kyle," said the woman. "And this is the boy." She said it not with dismissal but with the weight of someone for whom the boy was a category that carried genuine significance. She looked at Harry with those dark, sharp eyes. "Give me your hand," she said. Harry looked at Selina. Selina gave him the small nod that meant your call. He looked at Mara Voss and he held out his right hand. She took it in both of hers and was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to become something other than a pause. Then she said, in a voice that was considerably quieter than anything she'd said before, "Where did you find this child?" "Surrey," said Selina. "Surrey," Mara repeated, as though Surrey was the least likely origin point for whatever she was finding in Harry's hand. She looked up at him. He was watching her with those level green eyes, not pulling away, letting the assessment happen. "Do you know what you are?" "I know some things," he said. "I'm still learning the rest." Mara Voss smiled. It was the smile of someone who had been waiting, without knowing it, for a specific thing to arrive, and had just realized it had. "Well," she said, stepping back to let them in. "You had better come inside." The next 3 years were Prague and Gotham in alternation, and Harry grew the way well-watered things do, steadily and with an increasing sense of purpose. Mara taught him the theory first, because she was constitutionally incapable of doing anything else. The theory was old, older than Hogwarts, older than most things that called themselves old, and it said that magic was not a produced substance but a present one, saturating the world the way moisture saturated air, and that the difference between a magical person and a non-magical one was not the ability to generate magic but the ability to perceive it. And the difference between a wand user and a steel magic practitioner was the difference between fishing with a rod and fishing with your hands, more difficult, more direct, and when it worked, considerably more intimate. Wands are intermediaries, Mara said, in the kitchen of the Prague building, with Harry across the table from her and a cup of something that smelled like burnt amber between her hands. They are elegant tools. Precise. But they put distance between the practitioner and the work. Your kind of magic has no distance. My kind, Harry said. He was 12 and had the beginning of the particular sharpness that would define his adult face. How many of us are there? Practicing? She considered. Fewer than 30 in Europe. Perhaps 100 worldwide. Most are from families that predate the wand traditions. You are unusual because you came to it without that lineage, or rather, because you came to it with a lineage that doesn't know it has it. The Potters, he said. Because he knew his name by now. Selina had told him at 10, carefully and completely, including the parts she'd had to research herself, the wizarding world, Voldemort, the night on Godric's Hollow, the scar on his forehead that he'd always had and always wondered about. The Potters are old wand blood, Mara said. But your mother. She paused. Your mother was something different. Lily Evans, before she was Lily Potter. Muggle-born, they call it, as though the absence of a magical family is a deficit rather than a different origin. What the wand world doesn't account for is that some Muggle-born children are magical not because magic spontaneously generated in a non-magical line, but because they are the end point of a very long inheritance that traveled through families who never knew they had it. Your mother had steel magic in her hands. She never knew what it was, but she had it. Harry was quiet for a moment. Is that why the curse didn't kill me? Mara looked at him steadily. That is part of why, she said. Yes. What's the other part? She was quiet for a moment longer than seemed comfortable. That is something we will discuss when you are ready for the answer to be complicated. He didn't like that, she could see it, but he filed it away rather than pushing, which was one of the things she respected most about him. He knew how to wait. The physical training was harder than the theory and infinitely more satisfying. Mara had a room on the 4th floor, the room that had been locked when he first arrived and which had unlocked itself when he touched the door on his second visit, which Mara had noted in her journal with the single word yes, and in that room she taught him to reach. That was the only word for it, to extend his awareness outward like fingers, find the magic in the air and in objects and in the building's old stones, and pull on it the way you'd pull a thread. The first time he successfully drew magic from an enchanted object, a small carved figure that Mara used for practice because it held a mild warming charm, he felt it travel up his arm like the shock you got from a car door handle in winter, except warm instead of sharp, and he yelped and dropped it and Mara looked at him with calm satisfaction. Again, she said. Again, he said. It shocked me. It surprised you, she said. There's a difference. Again. By the time he was 13 he could draw the energy from a moderately enchanted object in under 3 seconds and redirect it into something else. By 14 he could absorb a spelled hex without a wand and return it modified. Mara watched him work with an expression that she only permitted herself in private, which was naked, uncomplicated pride. Selina watched from the doorway once and said nothing until they'd finished, and then she said to Mara, privately, should I be worried? No, said Mara. Should I be impressed? You can be both, Mara said. I am. Meanwhile Selina continued the other education, the one that didn't happen in rooms with locked doors. She taught him Gotham's rooftops and then every major city's rooftops they could reach. She taught him that the best way into a building was always the way the builder assumed nobody would use. She taught him to read people, the micro-expressions, the tells, the difference between someone who was nervous because they were scared and someone who was nervous because they were lying, and why that difference mattered. She taught him that a conversation was also a kind of theft. You could take information from someone who didn't know they were giving it, and you could give them something they didn't know they were receiving, and both of these were skills. He was, by 15, one of the best natural thieves she'd ever seen. And she had seen very good thieves. He was also, infuriatingly, someone who developed opinions and argued them clearly and refused to be wrong without evidence, which was less convenient in a partner than you might think. They argued about everything: strategy, ethics, the correct way to pick a Maglock 4000, he was right, which she found annoying, whether Gotham or Paris had better rooftops, she was right, which he found annoying, whether the man they'd been watching in Vienna was actually a target worth their time or just a pompous collector, they were both right, for different reasons, which resolved the argument with an unsatisfying draw. He was also, quietly, and without making a production of it, the person she would not trade for anything. She had not expected that. She had not planned for it. She had walked into a house in the middle of the night in Surrey 10 years ago and picked up something she'd had no business picking up, and she had never, not for a single moment, wished she'd left it where she found it. He knew about Hogwarts. He'd known since he was 10. The letters had started arriving, she'd intercepted the first 3, then told him about them, then watched his face as he processed the information that there was an entire school dedicated to what Mara was teaching him. "I don't need a school," he'd said, at 11. "Probably not," she'd agreed. "But there are things there I want to look at," he'd said, at 13. "The vault," she'd said. "Dumbledore has something that belonged to my mother," he said. "Something Mara said should have come to me." "Yes. The vault. You could go at 11 and be ahead of everyone," she'd offered. "I could go at 15 and be so far ahead that the comparison stops being interesting," he'd said, and smiled at her with that particular smile, the one she recognized as fundamentally his own, not learned from her, not learned from Mara, just Harry, which was perhaps the thing she was most proud of. So the letters had kept arriving. There had been 3 owls at this point, one of which had clearly had strong feelings about being kept waiting, and Harry had kept filing them away, until the September before his 15th birthday, in a flat in London that Selina was using as a base of operations for a job that had nothing to do with any of this. He said over breakfast, "I want to go this year." She looked at him. 15, tall, composed, green eyes still unreasonably sharp. The jacket he was wearing was one he'd picked from the good end of a Portobello Road market and had worn until it fit exactly right, which was a metaphor she'd thought about more than once. "Why now?" she said. "Mara says there are things about the curse that I need to understand and that the answers are in sources only Hogwarts has access to," he said. "And the vault. And honestly." A pause. "I'm curious about the school." "That's the first time you've admitted that." "I know." He was looking at his coffee. "I thought about it wrong for a long time. I thought of it as a place that was going to try to put me in a box. But Mara says it's more like a locked room, and I've never met a locked room I didn't eventually enjoy." She thought about that. She thought about him, 15 years old, walking into a school full of children who had grown up thinking he was one thing, carrying the history of a name that meant something to all of them, trained by 2 of the most dangerous women in Europe and armed with a magical discipline that predated their entire tradition. "Try not to take anything they'll actually miss," she said. "I make no promises," he said. She reached across the table and pressed her hand briefly against the top of his head, his ridiculous, hopeless hair, and then pulled it back and picked up her coffee, and he did the same, and that was how they decided. The Hogwarts letter that finally got a response came back with a note that was polite and informative and committed to nothing, which Selina recognized as Harry's negotiating tone. 2 weeks before September 1st, a reply arrived from a Professor McGonagall that was considerably more brisk than the original letters, presumably because someone at Hogwarts had worked out that several years' worth of increasingly urgent correspondence had been handled with the casual attention Harry reserved for things he'd already decided about. He needed supplies. He needed a wand. He already had everything he actually needed. But a wand was, apparently, the custom, and Harry had a healthy respect for customs that helped him blend into rooms, so on a Wednesday in late August they took the train to London and then a very specific walk to a very specific pub, and Selina pushed open the door of the leaky cauldron and felt, as she always did when she crossed into the wizarding world, the particular pleasure of walking into someone else's blind spot. The barman looked up. His eyes went to Harry, and did the thing that Selina had been watching happen for years whenever someone in the magical world saw Harry's face, the slight freeze, the widening, the almost recognition, because Harry looked like his father and had his mother's eyes, and those two pieces of information combined with the scar on his forehead told anyone who knew the history everything they needed to know. Harry looked back at him with calm, level attention. "We need the alley," Selina said. The barman pointed to the back with the slightly dazed quality of someone who'd just seen a ghost but wasn't sure if that was rude to say. Diagon Alley opened up behind the brick wall in its usual startling fashion, the way it always struck Selina as somewhat ostentatious, this explosion of color and noise and the smell of things burning and things growing and things being transmuted from one state to another, and Harry walked into it with the expression he wore when entering any new environment, absolutely neutral on the outside, processing everything at a pace that Selina privately thought might be illegal in some jurisdictions. He stopped just inside the entrance and he stood still for 10 full seconds. She'd learned not to interrupt this. He was reading the street. "3 people who know who I am," he said, quietly. "One of them is going to come over." She looked. He was right on all counts, and the one moving was a man in formal robes who was heading their way with the momentum of someone delivering important news. "Ministry official," Harry said. "Junior, judging by the way his shoes are shining but his collar isn't straight." "Eager. Nervous." The man arrived and said, breathlessly, "Excuse me, you're Harry Potter?" "Yes," Harry said. The man opened his mouth to deliver what was clearly prepared remarks and Harry said, pleasantly but with finality, "I need to get to Gringotts. Can you point me toward, a glance at the street, actually, I can see it from here." "Thank you." He walked away before the man could respond. Selina fell into step beside him. "You could have been slightly less smooth about that," she said. "Could I?" he said. "No," she said. "But it's nice to pretend you have room to grow." He grinned at her, bright and brief and genuine, and they kept walking. Gringotts was everything its reputation suggested, and Harry looked at it with the specific, warm attention he reserved for security systems he respected. He stood outside and looked up at it for a moment, at the carved warnings and the layered enchantments he could feel from the street, the way a musician might listen to a complicated piece before deciding to learn it. "Don't," said Selina. "I'm not doing anything," he said. "You have your planning face on. I have my interested face on. On you, those are the same face." He smiled and went up the steps. Inside, the goblins were exactly what Mara had described, compact, precise, operating on an economy of attention that Harry clearly found instinctively simpatico. He went to the counter and said, levelly, "I'd like to access my vault." "Harry Potter." The goblin who looked up had the expression of someone who'd expected to spend the day processing unremarkable transactions and was now recalibrating. It examined Harry for a long moment. Then it said, "Identification." Harry held out his hand, the scar on his forehead was visible, but it was his hand he offered, and Selina raised an eyebrow because she wasn't sure what that meant until the goblin leaned forward and looked at his palm and something in its posture changed fractionally. "The Potter Vault," it said. "Of course." As they descended in the rattling cart, Harry was quiet, looking at the enchantments on the tunnel walls with those eyes that saw too much. "There are 7 security layers on the main high-security corridor," he said, quietly. 3 mechanical, 2 magical, 2 hybrid. "Harry. I'm just observing." Observing with a criminal intensity. "I wonder," he said, still looking at the walls, "which vault Dumbledore uses for the things he doesn't want anyone to find." "We're not doing that today." "No," he agreed, easily. "Not today." The Potter Vault was considerable. Not the largest in Gringotts, Harry had already assessed that from the map Mara had shown him, cross-referenced with what the goblins' routing told him about where they were in the system, but substantial, and old, and the weight of it was something he stood with for a moment before he went in and took what he needed. He stood in the middle of the vault and looked around it, and Selina watched him feel, she'd learned to recognize it, the layered history of a place. His parents' gold. His parents' things, what remained of them, the physical residue of 2 lives cut short. He stood there for exactly 30 seconds. Then he picked up what he needed and turned around and walked back to her, and his face was the composed, neutral expression that she'd learned meant "I'm fine, do not ask me, I am in fact fine, please drop it." She dropped it. They went to Ollivander's last, after an hour in which Harry acquired his school supplies with the focused efficiency of someone who treated a shopping list as an optimization problem. He was polite to everyone and gave absolutely nothing away, and collected 3 separate attempts to engage him in conversation about his return to the wizarding world with the smooth, gracious deflection of someone who'd been managing adults' expectations since he was old enough to form sentences. Ollivander's was dim and strange and smelled of cedar and something older, and the wand maker himself appeared from between tall shelves like a thought surfacing and looked at Harry with moon-pale eyes. "I wondered," he said, "when you'd come." "Hello," said Harry. "The wand chooses the wizard, Mr. Potter." Though in your case, Ollivander's eyes moved to Harry's hands with an expression of someone seeing something that complicated their taxonomy, "I suspect the situation will be somewhat mutual." It took 11 wands. Each of the first 10 did nothing, not the gentle failure of a wrong fit but a more complete stillness, as though the wand was perfectly comfortable and Harry was simply elsewhere. Which he was, Selina suspected. The magic he used didn't move through instruments. It moved through him. The 11th wand was 11 inches, holly, phoenix feather. When Harry picked it up, it produced a warm cascade of gold and red sparks that was, Selina thought, slightly theatrical, as though it was very pleased with itself. Harry held it and looked at it with an expression of mild assessment. He gave it a small, controlled flick and the sparks doubled. "Curious," said Ollivander, in the quiet voice of someone updating their records. "Very curious. The phoenix whose tail feather is in your wand gave another feather." "Just one other." "It resides in the wand of Voldemort," Harry said. He said it the way he said everything, plainly. "Mara told me." Ollivander blinked. He looked as though several of his carefully maintained categories were experiencing structural stress. "Yes," he said. "Well. 7 galleons, Mr. Potter." Harry paid. He pocketed the wand. He walked to the door and held it open for Selina, and she went through it, and they stood in Diagon Alley in the late August afternoon, the wizarding world moving around them, and Harry said, turning the holly wand over once between his fingers before slipping it into his pocket, "It wants to be used." "What does that mean?" "It's eager," he said. "Like a new tool that hasn't been worked in yet." He paused. "I might actually like wand work. Don't tell Mara that." He smiled. "I won't." They walked back toward the leaky cauldron through the noise and color of Diagon Alley, and 3 people stopped to look at Harry as he passed, recognizing him, and he returned their looks with the same level attention he gave everything and felt nothing like the frightened, famous boy they'd been waiting for, nothing like the legend they'd been constructing in his absence, just himself, Harry, 15, composed, curious, already mapping the city within the city, and it was Selina, walking beside him, who let herself feel the fierce, quiet, complicated pride of it. She'd found him in a cupboard. He'd been saving half a bread roll for a worse emergency. Look at him now. September 1st was bright and slightly too warm for September, and King's Cross was its usual beautiful chaos. Harry moved through it with his trunk and his owl, a tawny owl he'd named Pick, for reasons that were either a comment on her beak or on her skill set, and Selina chose not to inquire further, and he found the barrier between platforms 9 and 10 with the casual attention of someone who had spent 4 years training to find hidden doors. He stopped in front of it. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Selina. She had taken her sunglasses off, which she almost never did in public, because she wanted him to be able to see her face. "Owl me," she said. "You hate the owl thing. I know. Do it anyway." He looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up his trunk and walked through the barrier, and she watched him go, watched the wall swallow him up, and she stood on platform 9 of King's Cross with her sunglasses off and her hands in her pockets and thought, "You are going to be the most interesting thing that school has ever seen, and also you are absolutely going to rob Albus Dumbledore, and I hope Mara and I taught you well enough for both of those things." She thought she probably had. She put her sunglasses back on and walked toward the exit, and somewhere on the other side of a wall Harry Potter was walking onto platform 9 3/4 for the first time with the polite, assessing attention of someone already planning 3 moves ahead. He'd been saving half a bread roll for a worse emergency. He didn't need to save things anymore. He was the emergency. Chapter 2, The Boy Who Stole Platform 9 3/4 was loud in the specific way of places that had decided noise was a tradition and were maintaining it proudly. Steam from the Hogwarts Express rolled across the platform in warm, theatrical billows, and the crowd was every variety of family farewell, tearful mothers, embarrassed children, fathers trying to appear less emotional than they were, younger siblings either devastated or smugly relieved. Trunks scraped on stone. Owls protested. Someone's cat had gotten loose and was being pursued with more urgency than dignity by a boy with a round, anxious face who kept apologizing to people he hadn't actually knocked over yet. Harry stepped through the barrier and stood for a moment, letting the scene arrange itself in his head. He could feel the enchantments from here. Not just the train, though the train was extraordinary, layered with travel charms and preservation spells and something older in the engine itself that hummed at a frequency he could feel in his back teeth, but the whole platform, sustained by decades of concentrated magical attention, held in a kind of collective belief that was its own form of power. Mara had taught him to feel that. Most wizards didn't notice it, the way you stopped noticing the sound of a clock after a while. Harry noticed it the way he noticed everything, with deliberate, cataloging attention. Pick shifted on top of the cage he was carrying, ruffled her feathers, and gave him a look that said she had opinions about being transported in a cage and intended to express them at length when the opportunity arose. "Almost there," he told her. She blinked. Unconvinced. He moved through the crowd with his trunk, not hurrying, reading the platform as he went. There were at least 40 families here that he could see, which meant, accounting for siblings and parents, perhaps 120 people. Of the children clearly heading onto the train, roughly a third were first-years by the look of them, wide-eyed, moving close to their parents, wearing new robes that still had that just-bought stiffness. The rest ranged from comfortable to deliberately casual, the older students performing indifference with varying degrees of success. 2 things caught his attention at almost the same moment. The first was a cluster near the middle of the platform, a family of redheads so comprehensively ginger that they functioned almost as a single visual unit, several children and a tired, warm-faced woman who was performing the small miracles of organization that only parents of large families ever really mastered. One of the boys, about Harry's age, was looking at the train with an expression of genuine, unguarded excitement that Harry found unexpectedly disarming. There was something straightforward about it. No performance, no posturing. Just someone who was genuinely glad to be here. The second was a girl sitting on her trunk near the train's third carriage, reading. Not pretending to read, not reading as a social signal, actually reading, with the focused immersion of someone who'd found a paragraph that required everything she had. She had bushy brown hair and was wearing robes that were perfect and pressed with a precision that told him she'd done it herself rather than being dressed by someone else. Her lips moved slightly as she read, which meant the text was dense enough to benefit from subvocalization. She had a highlighter in her left hand and wasn't using it, which meant she hadn't found anything highlightable yet, which meant the bar was high. He filed both of them and kept moving. The train was open. He found an empty compartment toward the front, not the very front, which would be conspicuous, and not the middle, which would fill up fastest, but 3 carriages back from the engine, a spot that said occupied but not social without being so isolated as to seem defensive. He stowed his trunk, settled Pick's cage on the luggage rack, and sat by the window. He had 20 minutes before departure. He used them. He took out the small leather notebook he'd carried since he was 12 and opened it to the section labeled H, for Hogwarts, not for anything personal, because Harry had other notebooks for personal things and kept his categories rigorous, and he reviewed what he knew. Dumbledore's vault, or more precisely, the chamber beneath Hogwarts that functioned as one, had been constructed in the early 1900s and accessed through a series of protection layers that changed on a rotating schedule that Mara had estimated but not confirmed. The object he was looking for, his mother's last recorded magical signature, captured in a small glass vial on the night of October 31, 1981, by Dumbledore himself, who had arrived at Godric's Hollow within hours of Voldemort and taken several things before the Ministry sealed the scene, was catalogued in a reference Mara had located in a Prague archive, a footnote in a letter Dumbledore had written to a colleague about the residual magical properties of a sacrifice-bound charm. His mother's magic. The last of it, contained and preserved and filed away as a research artifact by a man who had decided the protection it offered to the wizarding world was more important than the question of who it actually belonged to. Harry felt, reading his own notes, the thing he always felt when he thought about this specific subject. Not the hot, messy thing he occasionally saw in other people, the emotion that made people loud and imprecise. Something cleaner and colder and more focused. The way he felt looking at a lock. Here is a mechanism. Here is the gap. Here is how. He closed the notebook when he heard footsteps in the corridor. The compartment door opened and the round-faced boy from the platform looked in, slightly breathless, holding a cage in which a toad was attempting to make itself very flat against one wall. Sorry, do you mind? Everywhere else is full already and Neville says there's space at the front, but Neville also thought he packed his Remembrall and it was in his Grand's handbag, so, he paused, seeming to realize he was narrating. I'm Ron. Ron Weasley. Harry looked at him. Up close he had freckles and an open, readable face and the kind of eyes that had probably never successfully hidden a feeling in their life. Harry, he said. Come in. Ron came in and stowed a battered trunk, older than Harry's, clearly handed down, and dropped into the seat opposite, and then his ears went slightly pink because he'd clearly just registered the scar on Harry's forehead, which was visible because Harry's fringe did whatever it wanted and today had apparently decided to go right. Ron started. Yes, Harry said. Right, Ron said. Then, visibly collecting himself, your owl's brilliant. Harry looked at Pick, who was sitting on the cage perch with the composure of someone who knew they were being complimented and considered it no more than their due. She's smart, Harry said. She'll pick your pocket if you're not careful. Ron laughed, an honest, startled laugh, and some of the self-consciousness went out of him. My family's all been at Hogwarts, he said, in the easy way of someone filling comfortable silence. Mum, Dad, all my brothers. Charlie's in Romania doing dragons, which sounds brilliant but also terrifying, and Percy just made prefect, which he hasn't stopped mentioning, and Fred and George are 5th year and honestly, he stopped. You probably don't know any of them. No, Harry said. But I know about dragons. From where? I grew up, elsewhere, Harry said. Not in the wizarding world. Ron processed this. But you're famous. I know about it, Harry said. I find it less interesting than dragons. Ron grinned. Yeah, fair. The train lurched and began to move, which pulled Ron to the window and the leaving London enthusiasm that Harry watched with genuine if oblique warmth. He'd grown up in Gotham, which was not a city that did sentimentality about departure, but he understood the pull of it, the way motion felt like permission. They were 20 minutes out of London when the compartment door opened again, this time without knocking, which Harry clocked before he saw the face. 3 of them. The boy in front was blonde, pale, and wearing robes that had clearly been bought for the specific purpose of looking expensive. He moved with the particular ease of someone who'd grown up being the most important person in every room they'd entered, which meant he hadn't yet been in a room where that wasn't true, which meant this was going to be one of the first times that happened, which Harry found mildly interesting. I heard Harry Potter was on the train, the boy said. You heard correctly, Harry said. The boy's eyes moved to him, doing the quick social assessment that Harry recognized as a trained behavior, learned from someone, a parent, probably, rather than a natural instinct. Draco Malfoy, he said, with the intonation of someone announcing something. Harry waited. When nothing came from Harry in return, no acknowledgement of the name's significance, no corresponding disclosure, just level attention, something shifted very slightly in Draco Malfoy's expression. A fractional recalibration. He'd expected a response that hadn't arrived. I could help you, he said, adjusting his approach with a smoothness that Harry gave him credit for. Knowing the right people matters at Hogwarts. My family has been at Hogwarts for generations, Harry said. I know. Most of the families in this world have been. That's not really a credential, it's just a timeline. The two boys behind Malfoy, large, purposeful, built like people whose job was to be in the background looking significant, remained in the background looking significant. Malfoy's jaw tightened, very slightly. You'll find things work differently in the wizarding world than where? Harry said, pleasantly. A pause. Then wherever you've been. I've been a lot of places, Harry said. They all had things to teach. What I've found is that the places most invested in telling me how they work are usually the ones with the most to lose if I figure it out myself. He tilted his head. Sit down if you want to talk. Stand in the doorway if you want to make an impression. But pick one, because the train's swaying and you've been shifting your weight for 30 seconds. The silence that followed was extremely full. Malfoy looked at him with an expression that was trying very hard to be contemptuous and was being undermined by something more complicated, something closer to genuine interest, which was probably not what he'd come in here planning to feel. Then he said, with a precision that suggested he was good at saving face, another time, Potter, and left. Ron stared at the closed door. That was Draco Malfoy, he said, in a tone that implied this was significant information Harry might have missed. I know, Harry said. His family were Death Eaters. Well, they said they were under the Imperius curse, but everyone knows, Ron. Harry looked at him. What do you think? Ron blinked. What? Not what everyone knows. What do you think? Ron opened his mouth, then closed it, then actually thought about it. Harry watched the process with approval, because it was not as common as it should be. I think, Ron said slowly, that his dad's a nasty piece of work and Draco's been learning from him since he was born, and I don't know if that makes Draco the same as his dad or just someone who hasn't figured out he has a choice yet. Harry nodded. That's a good answer. Ron seemed pleased, and slightly surprised at being pleased, in the way of someone not used to their opinions being solicited seriously. He opened his mouth to say something else and the compartment door opened a third time. This time it was the girl with the bushy hair and the highlighter. She came in already talking, not in a rude way, just in the way of someone with forward momentum and a purpose. Sorry, I know it's interrupting, but I've been looking for a toad, not my toad, I don't have a toad, a boy named Neville has lost one, and then I thought while I was at it I'd introduce myself because it's a long journey and it seemed practical. She turned to Harry and, unlike everyone else today, didn't visibly flinch at the scar. She looked at his face with the direct, appraising attention of someone running a quick competency assessment and not being subtle about it. You're Harry Potter. You're the second person to say that today, Harry said. Does it generally work as an opening? I suppose it depends what you're opening toward. She sat down without being invited, which he liked. I'm Hermione Granger. I've read about you, not about you specifically, obviously, but about the events, in modern magical history and the rise and fall of the dark arts and the chapter on the First Wizarding War in magical theory and practice. She paused. You're not what the books suggest. What do the books suggest? An infant, she said. The books basically stop in 1981. The implication is that you've been in some kind of stasis since then, which is obviously not the case. She was looking at him with the same focused attention she'd given the book on the platform, and Harry found it considerably more interesting than Malfoy's assessment had been, because hers was coming from genuine curiosity rather than social calculation. "Where did you grow up?" "Not in the wizarding world," he said. "With muggles?" "Technically," he said. She seemed to register that technically was doing significant work in that sentence and filed it away with the efficiency of someone who maintained a good internal archive. She turned to Ron. "Hi. Hermione Granger." "Ron Weasley," said Ron. "Oh, you're Charlie Weasley's brother. He wrote a paper on Antipodean Opalize that I thought was quite good." Ron looked slightly stunned at this. Yeah, he did. "How do you know about, I've read most of Dragon Studies Quarterly from the last 5 years," she said, without particular self-congratulation, just as information. "There isn't that much written on Opalize and his methodology was interesting." She looked back at Harry. "Did you do the reading? For Hogwarts, I mean." "I've memorized all the first-year texts and most of the second-year ones and started on third because the gap between first and second-year logic is significant in Transfiguration and I wanted to be prepared," Harry said. "Yes." She looked at him steadily. "Have you?" "I haven't read the school texts," he said. Something flickered in her expression, a preliminary judgment forming. "I've read things that aren't on the school texts," he said. She sat with that for a moment, the expression shifting from preliminary judgment to preliminary curiosity, which was a better place to be. "Like what?" He considered how much to give her. This was a calculation he made instinctively with everyone: what information served the situation, what information was too much too fast, what information opened a door he intended to open. With Hermione Granger he had a feeling the calculation was going to be more interesting than usual, because she wasn't going to let him give her calibrated half-answers without pushing on them. "Fundamental theory," he said. "Pre-Wand tradition. Some practical work in disciplines that aren't on the Hogwarts curriculum." Her eyes sharpened. "Pre-Wand tradition is barely documented. Most of the primary sources are in private collections or, how did you access?" She stopped. "You said not quite with muggles. You grew up with someone in the wizarding world." "Not exactly the wizarding world as you'd define it," he said. "More adjacent. People who operate outside the institutional structures." The look she gave him then was the most honest look anyone had directed at him all day, not awe, not assessment, just a person who had encountered a gap in their knowledge and was already planning how to close it. "I want to know more about this," she said. "Is that intrusive?" "It might be intrusive." "It's direct," Harry said. "I prefer direct." "Good," she said. Then, as if she'd completed one task and was moving to the next, "Neville's toad is probably in the luggage rack of one of the back compartments. Toads go up when they're distressed." She stood, nodded at both of them with the brisk satisfaction of someone who'd accomplished what they came for, and went back out into the corridor. Ron watched her go. "She's terrifying," he said. "She's brilliant," Harry said. "Those aren't mutually exclusive," Ron said. Harry looked at him. "No," he said, with genuine warmth. "They're really not." The rest of the journey passed in the easy rhythm of two people finding each other's conversational pace, which Harry had always been good at, reading what a person needed from a conversation and providing it without making a production of the process. Ron needed to be listened to, which was the need of someone from a large family who was used to talking into noise. He talked about Hogwarts with an enthusiasm that was completely free of pretension, about the Quidditch house teams and the castle's famous quirks and his brother's histories there, and Harry listened and filed it all and occasionally asked questions that made Ron's face do the surprised and pleased thing again. The light changed as they moved north, the flat green of the Midlands giving way to something older and more textured, the sky widening as they went further from the city. Harry watched it through the window and felt the landscape's magic, the ambient, deep magic of old Britain, the kind that had nothing to do with wands or schools or institutions, that was simply there in the soil and the stone and the low grey clouds. Mara had taught him to feel for it, and it felt different here than Prague, different than Gotham, different than anywhere he'd been. More present. Like the country knew something and was sitting with it. When the train stopped and everyone poured onto the platform at Hogsmeade Station in the dark and the cold, Harry stood for a moment and looked toward the lake, where the boats were being organized by a voice so large it suggested its owner had never once wondered about their authority. He looked across the water and saw the castle. He felt, against his will and without any preparation, something he hadn't expected to feel. Not the aesthetic appreciation he'd anticipated, because Hogwarts from across the lake was objectively extraordinary, towers and lights and the weight of 1,000 years of concentrated magical intention. Not even the thief's instinct, the reaching assessment of how a place was structured. Something quieter and less comfortable than either of those things. Something that said, "You come from here. Not from the school. From this. From the people who'd walked up these steps and sat in these boats and looked at this castle and felt the weight of the magic in it." His mother had looked at this. He got in a boat. He did not examine the feeling further. The entrance hall of Hogwarts was everything the approach had promised and the architecture was frankly showing off, but Harry had been in impressive buildings before and he was not going to give it the satisfaction of looking overwhelmed. He stood in the crowd of first years, taller than most of them by several inches, which came with being 4 years older than the standard intake, and looked around with the controlled attention that Selina would have recognized. The ghosts were interesting. The staircases were more interesting. The enchantments on the ceiling of the Great Hall, visible through the open doors, were the most interesting thing he'd seen since Gringotts. Professor McGonagall appeared and delivered the introductory remarks with the economy of someone who had done this many times and respected her audience enough not to embellish. Harry paid attention. She had the bearing of someone whose authority was entirely intrinsic, not performed, not maintained by threat, simply present, like the castle's enchantments. He made a note to take her seriously. The sorting was by hat, which he had known, but knowing and experiencing were different. The hat sat on a stool and sang and he listened to the song with genuine interest because the historical information in it was considerably more useful than its theatrical wrapper suggested. 4 founders. 4 houses. The specific values of each, not the clichés, the actual values that the song described, and there were distinctions there that the popular version of the story glossed over. Slytherin hadn't valued cunning as an end in itself, he'd valued resourcefulness and ambition, which were not the same thing at all. He watched the first years get sorted. Hermione went to Gryffindor with the hat barely touching her head. The round-faced boy, Neville Longbottom, and Harry recognized the name because Mara had told him the story of the 2 children who'd been candidates for Voldemort's attention that night, went to Gryffindor with the hat taking a significantly longer time, which was interesting. Ron went to Gryffindor and looked relieved in the specific way of someone whose entire family had gone before them. Draco Malfoy went to Slytherin and did not look surprised. Then, Potter, Harry. The hall, which had been doing the steady ambient murmur of a large crowd, went quiet in a way that had texture to it. Not silence, anticipation. Harry walked to the stool and sat down and the hat dropped over his ears and said, in his head, in a voice that was dry and old and amused in a way that suggested it had seen a great deal and found most of it less surprising than people hoped, "Well. You're a late arrival." "I had things to do," Harry thought back. "So I gather." A pause, not a hesitation, more a savoring, the way you paused with a complicated taste. "You're not what they're expecting. You know that." "I know. They expect a boy who's been waiting to be found. Someone grateful. Someone who needs this place." "I don't need it," Harry agreed. "But I want to understand it. There's a difference." "Indeed there is." Another pause, longer. Harry felt the hat moving through him the way Mara's assessment had moved through him, that first day in Prague, something reading the layers. "Oh, that's interesting. That's very interesting. I haven't felt that in a long time. You have the old magic in you, boy. The kind that pre-exists everything in this room." "I know," Harry said. "And something else," the hat said, more quietly. "Something that's been in you since you were 1 year old. Do you know about that?" Harry's jaw tightened, fractionally. I have a theory. Your theory is correct, the hat said. And that complicates things considerably. It was quiet for a moment, genuinely quiet, not performing thought but actually doing it. You could belong to any house. You have Slytherin's resourcefulness in the truest sense. You have Ravenclaw's hunger for knowledge. You have Hufflepuff's loyalty, not to institutions, but to people, which is the harder loyalty. And you have, a pause, Gryffindor's willingness to walk into rooms that should make you afraid without letting them know they should. Then pick one, Harry thought. I'm not difficult about it. That, said the hat, with something that sounded remarkably like a laugh, is an extremely Gryffindor thing to say. Gryffindor, it shouted. The table in red erupted, and Harry pulled the hat off and handed it back to Professor McGonagall, who was looking at him with the expression of someone noting something for future consideration, and he walked to the Gryffindor table to applause that was louder than it had been for anyone else, because his name meant something to these people even if it meant something different to him. He sat down between Hermione and an empty space that Ron shortly filled, arriving from the stool with a grin bright enough to read by. Gryffindor, Ron said. Same as everyone. Your whole family, Hermione said, with the tone of someone who had already catalogued this information. Yeah. Ron looked at Harry. The hat took ages with you. Did it? Harry said, with perfect neutrality. Almost 3 minutes. Longest in years, Fred says. Ron gestured down the table at the twins, who waved with the identical, sharp-eyed grin of people who collected information as a hobby. What did it say? It had thoughts, Harry said. Hermione looked at him sideways. He could feel the question she wasn't asking yet. She had the instincts of someone who knew that pressing too early lost you access, who had already decided to play a longer game. He found this gratifying. The feast arrived and was extraordinary, and Harry ate with the deliberate appreciation of someone who had always understood, at a cellular level, that food was not a given. The hall around him was a sustained spectacle, the enchanted ceiling showing a clear night sky above the candles, the 4 house tables in their arranged formality, the staff table at the front where Harry spent a portion of the meal examining each professor with methodical attention. Dumbledore was at the center. Harry had seen photographs, Mara had photographs, but photographs hadn't prepared him for the actual presence of the man, which was considerable. He was old in the way of things that had been intensely alive for a long time, and he had the eyes of someone who had learned to appear absent while being absolutely attentive. He sat at the center of the staff table and looked out over the hall with the benign, twinkling warmth of the school's beloved patriarch, and Harry looked at him steadily and thought, "You know I'm here. You knew the moment I sat down." Dumbledore's gaze moved across the hall and for 1 second rested on Harry, and Harry held it, level and entirely unintimidated, and something moved briefly across the old man's face, not surprise, not quite, more the expression of a chess player finding a new piece on the board. Harry picked up his fork and returned to his food. On his left, Hermione said, quietly, "You just stared down Dumbledore." "Did I?" he said. "For 7 seconds," she said. "I counted." "You were counting." "I was observing," she said. "The distinction matters." Harry looked at her. She was looking at her plate with the careful neutrality of someone who was testing whether he'd find the observation amusing or threatening. He decided to let her see which. "Mara says that too," he said. Hermione looked up. "Who's Mara?" "Someone who taught me things," he said. "I think you'd like her. She'd terrify you, but you'd like her." Hermione processed this. "Is she the person you learned the Pre-Wand theory from?" "Among other things," he said. Hermione opened her mouth and then very deliberately closed it, filing the conversation in the mental folder she'd clearly opened for things to return to when I have more data. Harry noted this with appreciation. At the end of the hall, Dumbledore stood and gave the welcome remarks, which were brief, warm, and positioned a genuine intelligence behind the performance of grandfatherly benevolence. He announced the 3rd-floor corridor restrictions. He introduced staff. When he came to defense against the dark arts he said, Professor Quirrell, who I'm sure will give you an excellent year," and something changed very briefly in his intonation on excellent, a slight flatness that could have been anything, that Harry catalogued and kept. He looked at Quirrell. The man was wearing a purple turban and had the bearing of someone holding themselves together with deliberate effort, the way a person looked when they were in pain and performing normalcy over it. His eyes were quick and didn't settle. He was nervous in the way that had nothing to do with the social anxieties of a mild-mannered academic and everything to do with the nervous system of someone carrying something that disagreed with their presence. Harry felt, across the hall, the faint wrongness of it. Not magic exactly, or not only magic, but a doubled presence. Two things in one space. He'd felt that once before in Prague, when Mara was demonstrating a possessing charm on a volunteer, and even that had felt cleaner than this. He made a note of it and set it aside for later examination. After dinner, the prefects led the Gryffindors to the tower, up staircases that moved and through corridors that seemed to reconsider their arrangements while you walked through them. Harry navigated this with the attention of someone who was already building an internal map, noting landmarks, noting where the castle's enchantments were densest, noting which walls had the particular resonance of something hidden behind them. The common room was red and gold and warm with fire and portraits, and the portraits watched Harry come in with a range of expressions from curious to apprehensive that he found interesting. Portraits in the magical world retained personality, and personality had opinions. He noted which ones were watching most closely. Ron pulled him into a corner by the fire and said, with the conspiratorial energy of someone who could not believe his own luck, "You're Harry Potter and you're in Gryffindor and you're my dormitory mate." "I am all those things," Harry agreed. "Fred and George are going to lose their minds. I look forward to it." Hermione appeared on Harry's other side, already holding a book that she must have produced from somewhere in her robes. "When do first years get their timetables?" "Tomorrow morning, Professor McGonagall gives them out at breakfast," Ron said, and then blinked. "How do you know about timetables?" "Books," she said, in the tone of someone explaining something extremely obvious. Ron looked at Harry with an expression that said "see." And Harry returned a look that said "I told you," and Hermione, catching some of this, looked between them with the expression of someone who had not yet decided whether being the subject of a shared look was flattering or annoying. In the dormitory, Harry's bed was by the window. He'd moved himself to it calmly while the other boys sorted themselves out, because the window gave him sight lines and ventilation and was simply the better choice. He sat on the edge of the bed for a moment after the others were asleep or close to it, and he looked at the castle beyond the glass, its towers dark against a clouded sky. He took his leather notebook from his bag and he opened it to a fresh page. At the top he wrote Hogwarts, Day 1, and then he sat for a moment with the quill and thought about what to write. He wrote, "Dumbledore is sharper than he performs. Quirrell is compromised, investigate. Third floor corridor is the public decoy, not the actual primary security. Vault access likely deeper. Hermione Granger is exceptional. Investigate possibility of research partnership." He paused, then added, "The castle knows I'm here. Not in a threatening way. More like, recognition." He closed the notebook. Pick, on her perch by the window, looked at him with her steady amber eyes. "I know," he said. "Don't tell Selina I said that." Pick made a small, private sound that was either agreement or mockery. With her, it was genuinely difficult to tell. The next morning ran on 2 hours of sleep, which Harry was entirely comfortable with. Selina had long since cured him of the illusion that 8 hours was a prerequisite for function, and he was down in the common room before anyone else, reading, when Hermione arrived at 6:15 and stopped in the doorway at the sight of him with the expression of someone who had expected to be alone and was having complicated feelings about not being. "Early," she said. "You too," he said. She came and sat in the chair across from him, which was not the chair on the same side of the fireplace, which told him something about how she wanted this morning to go, proximate but boundaried, still figuring out the shape of things. He put his book face down and gave her his attention. "What are you reading?" she said. He held it up. It was Mara's own manuscript, handwritten, in 3 languages, on the theoretical framework of steel magic, and not a thing anyone else in this castle would have or recognize. Hermione looked at the cover, or rather, at the handwritten title in the Czech and Latin that comprised the first two languages, and her eyes did the thing they did when she encountered something she wanted very much and was trying to be measured about. "Can I?" "Not yet," he said. "Not because I don't want to show you. Because I need to understand what you already know before I give you something that's going to restructure a lot of it." She sat with this. "That's patronizing," she said, testing it. "Is it?" he said. "Or is it practical?" A moment. "It's practical," she admitted, without much grace but with honesty, which he liked. "How will you know when I know enough?" "I'll give you a passage and we'll talk about it," he said. "If you can push back on it, we're there. And if I can't push back on it? Then you read more until you can," he said. "You're clearly good at that." She looked at him with that same frank, assessing gaze that was, he was increasingly sure, simply her default mode of attention, not aggressive, not performative, just direct. "You're not what I expected," she said. "And I'd done quite thorough research." "What did you expect?" She considered. "Someone who needed catching up," she said. "Someone who would need guidance on the basics. The books all imply, not directly, but by omission, that you've spent the last 14 years essentially on pause." "I wasn't on pause," he said. "No," she said. "Clearly not. A pause. Was it hard? Growing up outside all of this?" He thought about the cupboard. About the walk through Gotham streets at 3 in the morning with shoes that didn't fit. About Selina's rooftops and Mara's fourth-floor room and the long, excellent education of 10 years spent learning the world from people who knew it outside its official borders. "No," he said, and meant it. She looked at him for a moment and seemed to believe him, which was the correct response because it was true. "Good," she said. "Then, practical as ever, McGonagall will be down in 40 minutes. Should we go to breakfast?" "In a minute," he said. "I want to ask you something." She waited. "The third-floor corridor," he said. "Dumbledore said it was forbidden. What's your read on why?" She blinked. The shift from personal conversation to what was clearly an analytical question. She adjusted, and the adjustment was fast. "He said there was something dangerous there," she said. "Most people will take that at face value." "Most people," Harry said. "Well." She straightened slightly. A restricted corridor on the third floor of a school full of children is either a genuine danger that someone made a poor security decision about, or it's a deliberate misdirection. Toward what? Toward the assumption that whatever it is, it's on the third floor, she said, slowly, working through it. When in fact, she stopped. Harry watched her get there. When in fact, she said, more carefully, the thing worth protecting is somewhere else. The third floor is the warning that tells you what direction not to look. That's one reading, Harry said. She looked at him with those bright, sharp eyes. You've already looked, she said. Not an accusation. An inference, and she was proud of it, and he was glad she was. Not yet, he said. But I will. She absorbed this. He waited for the objection, the rules, the danger, the voice of institutional caution that she'd been wrapped in all her life. It didn't come. What came instead was, when you do, she said, I want to know what you find. He looked at her. Deal, he said. She nodded, with the brisk satisfaction of someone who'd struck a useful agreement, and stood up. Now can we go to breakfast? Yes, he said. Now we can go to breakfast. They went down together through the waking castle, and Harry felt the stones under his feet and the enchantments in the walls and the ancient, attending presence of Hogwarts itself, and he thought about the vault below it, the thing Dumbledore was keeping, the last of his mother's magic, sealed in glass and filed under protection rather than return. He thought about what Hermione had said, the warning that tells you what direction not to look. He was looking in the right direction. He was already planning. Chapter 3, Lessons nobody teaches. The first defense against the dark arts class was on a Thursday morning, and Harry already knew 3 things about it before he walked through the door. He knew Quirrell was compromised. The doubled presence he'd felt at the feast had only sharpened in the intervening days, every glimpse of the man in corridors confirming it. He knew the class would be taught at approximately a quarter of the actual content's depth, because a compromised teacher was a distracted one. And he knew, from Hermione, who had read the last 6 years of student testimonies that somehow existed in Hogwarts, a history's appendix, that defense against the dark arts had not had a competent teacher since a woman named Galatea Merithot retired in 1945, and that the position had been bleeding staff with such consistency that most of the school treated the subject as a formality rather than an education. What he didn't know, walking in, was that Quirrell's classroom smelled of garlic in quantities that crossed the line from seasoning to architectural feature, or that Quirrell had arranged the desks with the particular anxiety of someone who needed people to face a specific direction and not another specific direction, or that there was a locked cabinet at the back of the room with an enchantment on it that was not a school-standard locking charm but something considerably more personal and considerably more desperate. Harry took a desk in the middle of the room, facing forward, and within 10 seconds had located 4 exits and catalogued the enchantment on the cabinet with the part of his attention that did these things automatically, the way other people breathed. Ron dropped into the seat beside him. Hermione was already seated on Harry's other side, her textbook open to chapter 1, her notes prepared with the organized enthusiasm of someone who had been looking forward to this. She'd highlighted 3 sections of the chapter already, and Harry had learned not to comment on the highlighter because the last time he'd made a mild observation about it she'd given him a comprehensive explanation of chromatic memory retention theory that had been genuinely interesting and also 17 minutes long. Quirrell came in and put his bag on the desk with the practiced motions of someone going through familiar motions in an unfamiliar body, just slightly offset from where a naturally moving person would place things. He turned around and Harry saw his face. The quick, unsettled eyes, the way he never quite looked directly at any one person for more than a second, and the slight, persistent tension at his temples, like someone listening to a voice nobody else could hear. "Gee, good morning," Quirrell said, and his stutter was real, but the nervousness behind it was not the nervousness of a shy man, it was the nervousness of a man performing shyness over something else entirely. "Today we'll be discussing the dark arts in a theoretical context. Please open your books to chapter 1. Harry already had his book closed on the desk in front of him, with his hands flat on the cover and his attention on Quirrell. Hermione noticed. She looked at the closed book, then at Harry, then at the closed book again with the expression of someone exercising restraint. She said nothing. Quirrell began. He talked about the dark arts in the careful, hedged language of someone relaying information they had a complicated relationship with, circling the interesting parts and landing reliably on the safe ones. He used the passive voice in almost every sentence, which was the grammatical choice of someone who wanted to describe events while removing their own involvement. Harry had heard this verbal pattern before, in witnesses who knew more than they were saying, in Gotham's precinct hallways, in the mouths of people who had been somewhere they shouldn't be. 20 minutes in, Quirrell was explaining the classification system of dark spells, Class 1, Class 2, Class 3, and Harry raised his hand. Quirrell's eyes landed on him with the particular weight of a man who'd known this was coming and had spent the morning dreading it. "Why yes, Mr. Potter. The classification system only accounts for spells currently recognized by the Ministry," Harry said. "Pre-wand dark arts don't classify because they don't use wand mechanics. How does the curriculum handle those?" A short silence. "Pre-wand, well, those are," Quirrell's hands moved in a small, deflecting gesture, "those are extremely rare. They're outside the scope of Ministry classification," Harry said, pleasantly. "That's not the same as outside the scope of defense. If I were defending against something that predated the wand tradition, the Ministry's Class 3 catalog wouldn't tell me much." "That's a very unusual question for a first. It's a standard question if your education started in the right place," Harry said. "Not challenging. Just factual. I'm not trying to make trouble. I genuinely want to know if the curriculum covers it." Quirrell looked at him for 3 full seconds longer than was comfortable. Harry held the look with complete, pleasant equanimity. He wasn't pushing against the man, not yet. He was just being honest, which was occasionally more unsettling than aggression. No, Quirrell admitted. The C curriculum does not cover pre-wand traditions. Then I'll do parallel reading, Harry said, and opened his textbook to chapter 1 with every appearance of cooperative engagement. Hermione, on his left, made a very small sound that was probably related to pressing her lips together. On his right, Ron had his chin in his hand and was watching Harry with the expression of someone watching a sport they'd just discovered and were already enthusiastic about. After class, in the corridor, Hermione said, "You knew he couldn't answer." "I knew he hadn't thought about it," Harry said. "Those are different. The effect is the same. The distinction matters for whether I respect him or don't," Harry said, which made Hermione pause in a way that suggested she was adding it to the mental folder. Ron said, "What is pre-wand dark arts, anyway?" "Ancient magical practice that predates standardized wand use," Harry said. "Think of it like the difference between a printed map and knowing how to navigate by stars. The map is precise and portable and most people can use it. The stars require a different kind of knowledge, take longer to learn, and don't show up in any official cartography." Ron digested this. "And you can do it?" "Some of it," Harry said, which was technically true in the sense that some of it encompassed everything Mara had taught him while leaving room for more, which was always the more honest framing. Ron looked at him with open admiration that Harry consistently found both touching and slightly uncomfortable, not because he didn't like Ron, but because admiration had historically been the precursor to expectations, and expectations were the first step toward disappointment. Ron's admiration, though, had an unusual quality. It wasn't the awe the rest of the school had been pointing at Harry since the feast, the famous name admiration, the legend polishing. It was something more personal. Ron was impressed by Harry specifically, the actual person he'd been sitting across from on the train and in the dormitory, and that was different enough to matter. "Right," Ron said. "Can you teach me?" "Maybe," Harry said. "But first you'd need to understand the theory, and the theory is annoying." "How annoying?" "Hermione read the first passage I gave her and responded with a 16-point written critique," Harry said. Hermione, who had been ahead of them by 3 steps, turned around. 14-point, she said. 2 of the points were related and I should have consolidated them. It was impressive, Harry told her. "I know," she said. Potions was Professor Snape, and Snape was something else entirely. He came into the dungeon classroom with the specific force of someone whose authority was entirely real and entirely self-generated, not performed, not institutional, not borrowed from a title. He had it the way Selina had it, the way Mara had it, as a fundamental property of his own presence. Harry sat up slightly without deciding to, the way you sat up when something interesting entered a room. Snape looked at the class with the cool, examining gaze of a person who had taught too long to have illusions about first years and had decided to be honest about this rather than performing enthusiasm. He talked about the subtlety of potions, the delicacy and precision, the scientific artistry of it, and Harry listened with genuine interest because Snape was describing something real, not a curriculum, not a subject, but a discipline, and there was a difference and Snape knew it. Then Snape said, "Potter." Harry looked up. "What?" Snape said, with the particular intonation of a man who had been waiting for this moment and had prepared it carefully. "Would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood?" The class had gone quiet in the way of people watching something be dismantled, because Snape's tone made clear that this was not a genuine question but a demonstration. He expected Harry not to know, and intended to make that failure the first thing the class learned. Harry held his gaze for a moment. He thought about what he knew about asphodel and wormwood, which was not nothing. Mara's teaching had included a section on magical chemistry that most wand tradition curricula skipped, and she had used potions as an example of practical magical theory because, she'd said, understanding what things did when they combined was fundamental to understanding what magic did when it combined. "Draft of living death," Harry said. "One of the most powerful soporifics in magical pharmacology." The infusion of wormwood makes the asphodel's effect both deeper and more reversible than either substance achieves alone. The wormwood acts as a synergistic modifier rather than a straightforward addition. You're not adding two sleep-inducing agents, you're creating a third compound with different properties than either precursor. The silence had a different quality now. Snape looked at him. His expression had not changed in any visible way, but something behind his eyes was moving. He said, without adjusting his tone, "Where would you look if I told you to find me a bezoar?" "A goat's stomach," Harry said. "Specifically a goat that's grazed on the right plants. The type of stone depends on the animal's diet. It's a universal antidote for most poisons because it works by binding to the compounds rather than neutralizing them chemically. Useful but limited, it doesn't work on complex combined poisons or curse-based toxins." "The difference," Snape said, quietly, "between monkshood and wolfsbane?" "There isn't one," Harry said. "They're the same plant. Aconitum. The different names come from different traditions. Wolfsbane is the older, more folkloric name. Monkshood is the reference used in post-17th century botanical taxonomies. Both are highly toxic at most preparation levels, but in regulated doses they're used in transformation resistance drafts." He paused. The naming inconsistency is actually an interesting case study in how the magical tradition absorbed folk practice into institutional pharmacology. The plant's function didn't change, the language around it was standardized to make it controllable. The class was very, very quiet. Snape stared at him for a long moment. This was not the look of a man who'd been bested in a demonstration. Snape didn't perform that kind of wound. This was the look of a man doing rapid recalculation, a chess player reassessing the board after an unexpected response. "Seat yourself, Mr. Potter," he said. "I am seated," Harry said. Another pause. "Indeed," Snape said, and turned to the board. Ron, beside Harry, was making a sound approximately like a kettle that hadn't quite reached boiling. Harry kicked him gently under the table. After class, in the corridor outside the dungeon, Hermione said, "He was going to embarrass you." "I know," Harry said. "You were ready for it. Selina says you walk into every room prepared for the thing the room is trying to do to you," Harry said. "Not so you can defeat it. So you can choose whether to let it happen." Hermione thought about this for several steps. "And you chose not to let it happen." "I chose to answer honestly," Harry said. "The rest was his calculation to make." "He's going to have feelings about you all year," Ron said, with the pragmatic certainty of someone whose family had been navigating Snape for generations. "He'll respect competence eventually," Harry said. "He just needs more data." "You're very optimistic about him." "I'm realistic," Harry said. "He's brilliant. Brilliant people usually come around to evidence if you give them enough of it." Ron looked at him. "My brother Percy's brilliant and he's never come around to anything." "Percy's institutional," Harry said. "Snape isn't. He has his own standards. Those are actually easier to meet than institutional ones, if you know what they are." Hermione had stopped walking. They were at the point where the corridor split toward the library and toward the tower, and she was standing at the junction with the expression of someone who had just connected two things. "You do this on purpose," she said. Harry looked at her. "You study people," she said. "Not just, academically. You study them the way you study the other things. You figure out what they respond to and what they don't, and then you behave accordingly." She paused. "That's not manipulation. It's social analysis." "They overlap," Harry said honestly. "Where's the line? Whether you're using the analysis to help yourself at their expense or to make the interaction better for both of you," he said. "I'm not interested in taking things from people who haven't got it coming. Life is long and rooms are small and burning bridges is expensive." Hermione looked at him for a moment. "That's very Slytherin," she said. "The Hat considered it," he said. "And chose Gryffindor." Because apparently deciding to walk into interesting danger without looking frightened is more definitional than strategic thinking, he said, with a mild irony that made her smile, quickly, like sunlight through a gap in clouds, and then composed again. Right, she said. Library? Library, he agreed. The library was the best room in the castle. Harry had decided this on his first visit on the second day, and the subsequent week had not changed his assessment. It was not the best room because of the books, though the books were extraordinary, and he'd identified 17 texts in the first hour that weren't on any curriculum and were more useful than the ones that were. It was the best room because of what Madame Pants had built with it, a system. Clear, rigorous, internally consistent, protective of its contents without being hostile to genuine inquiry. Madame Pants herself was a woman of about 60 with the focused, territorial calm of someone who had decided that her library was the most important place in the world and organized her entire personality around protecting that assessment, and Harry had enormous respect for this. He'd been polite and precise and deferential in the way that showed he understood the system, and by the third day Madame Pants was pointing him toward sections unprompted, which was not a privilege she extended casually. Hermione, watching this, had said, "She's never pointed me anywhere unprompted and I've been in here every day." "You treat the books like resources," Harry said. "She treats them like charges. You have to show her you understand the difference." "I love books," Hermione said, with genuine offense. "You love what books can give you," Harry said. "She loves the books themselves. It's a different relationship." Hermione had stared at him for a moment and then gone back to Madame Pants with a different approach and come back 20 minutes later with 3 texts and a slightly odd expression. "She showed me the restricted section catalogue," she said. "I know," Harry said. "How?" "Because you're now treating the library the right way," he said. "She responds to that." They had established, by the end of the second week, a working pattern. Mornings were classes. Afternoons were split between coursework, which Harry did efficiently and without particular drama, because the content was several years behind what Mara had already covered, but the application of wand work was genuinely new and interesting, and the other work, which was the vault. In the evenings, after dinner, they were in the library, and the work there had 2 tracks, Hermione's visible track, which was coursework in supplementary reading and the systematic demolition of every gap in her knowledge, and Harry's less visible track, which was the gradual, patient construction of a map. Not a physical map. A structural one. The architecture of Hogwarts security, built from cross-referencing historical records, Mara's notes, what Harry could feel with his own hands when he moved through the castle, and what the castle itself seemed to be doing, because Hogwarts was alive in the most literal sense Harry had encountered for a building, the enchantments not static but responsive. And a responsive system was both harder and easier to navigate than a static one. Harder because it adapted. Easier because adaptation meant communication, and communication meant information. He was 2 weeks into this when Hermione sat down across from him in the library one evening and put a piece of parchment on the table between them. He looked at it. It was a diagram, pencil, neat and precise, showing what appeared to be a cross-sectional view of Hogwarts from the ground floor to the 7th story, with certain rooms indicated and certain spaces conspicuously blank. "The blank spaces," she said, "are places where the castle's dimensions don't add up." He looked at her. "I've been measuring," she said. "Counting paces in corridors, comparing the library records of original floor plans against the current layout. The castle has been modified 11 times since original construction, and the modifications always add rather than subtract, except in 3 locations where the physical space should be larger than it appears, which means there's something taking up the space that isn't on any plan." She was, he realized, doing her own investigation. Not from his starting point, she didn't know about the vault, not specifically, but from pure architectural curiosity applied with her typical, relentless rigor. She'd gotten here independently. He picked up the parchment and looked at it properly. The 3 blank spaces were, one on the 7th floor, one in the dungeons, and one in the area she'd labeled as sub-basement, below even the dungeons, deeper than any official plan acknowledged. "Where did you get the original floor plans?" he said. Hogwarts, a history has them in Appendix C, she said. You have to request the full archive edition, which most people don't know exists. Madam Pants has a copy. He turned the parchment over in his hands. The sub-basement space aligned precisely with what he'd been sensing, the deep, dense concentration of layered enchantments that he could feel when he stood in certain parts of the dungeons and extended his attention downward. It was below Quirrell's locked cabinet, below the potions classroom, below everything the school presented as its lowest level. He put the parchment down and looked at her. This is good work. I know, she said. Not arrogant. Just accurate. What do you know that you're not telling me? He considered. The deal he'd offered her was information in exchange for information, and she'd just delivered something concrete. There's a vault, he said. Her eyes went still in the way of someone receiving significant new information and refusing to react until they'd processed it. Below the school. Below the school. Protected by multiple security layers, I can feel at least 5 from the dungeons, and there are likely more that I can't sense from this distance. The third-floor corridor is misdirection. Whatever's in the vault, Dumbledore wants people looking at the wrong level. What's in the vault? Several things, probably. The one I'm specifically interested in is a small glass vial. He paused. It contains the last recorded magical signature of my mother. Hermione was quiet for a long moment. Your mother died the night Voldemort came, she said carefully. The night Voldemort came, Harry said, Dumbledore arrived at Godric's Hollow within hours of the event. Before the Ministry sealed the scene. He took certain objects from the ruins that he considered strategically important. He held her gaze. One of them was a residual magical signature, my mother's last spell, essentially, the echo of the sacrificial protection she created. He's kept it as a research artifact. A study specimen for the mechanics of love-based protection magic. The quality of Hermione's silence changed. That belonged to you, she said. It belongs to me, he said. Past tense is inaccurate. Something moved through her expression, not quite anger, which surprised him, because he'd expected her instinct to be rule application before feeling. But she was Hermione, and Hermione's instincts were sharper than her reputation for rule-following suggested. What drove the rules, for her, was a deep and genuine sense of fairness. And this was not fair, and she knew it immediately. You came to Hogwarts for this, she said. I came for several reasons, he said. This is one of them. And you're going to, what? Steal it back. Yes, he said, without any particular drama. I'm going to steal it back. She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at her diagram on the table between them. She looked at her own hands. I can't, she said. I can't be involved in breaking into a vault under Hogwarts. Not yet. She said the last 2 words with the honesty of someone who was being accurate rather than principled. I don't have enough information. I don't know what the other security layers involve. I don't know if it's dangerous. I can't make a reasonable assessment of the risk with what I currently know. That's fair, he said. You're not going to try to convince me? No, he said. You're telling me your information threshold. I can respect that. She looked at him like he was a puzzle she was still working through. You're very unusual, she said. You've said that before. It keeps being true. She pulled the parchment back. But I'll keep looking at the architecture. And I'll tell you what I find. Good, he said. She nodded and opened her textbook, and he opened his notebook, and they sat in companionable near silence for the next 2 hours, which was one of Harry's favorite things about her. She was excellent at silence. She didn't fill it and she didn't resent it. Ron arrived at 8:30, slightly red-faced and carrying a chess set under one arm, and said, the third-year prefect just said something very stupid about Gryffindor losing the House Cup again this year, and I need someone to beat me at chess so I can practice feeling calm about it. You want me to beat you? Harry said. I want to get better, Ron said. You can't get better playing people you can beat. Harry closed his notebook and reached for the chess set. Hermione turned a page and pretended she wasn't smiling. The charms class was with Flitwick, who was tiny and enthusiastic and technically brilliant in the specific way of someone who had mastered their subject completely enough to teach it with genuine joy. Harry enjoyed charms more than he'd expected to. Wand work, it turned out, had a physical elegance that Mara's training had never given him, the snap and precision of a directed movement producing a specific result, and he found the mechanics of it genuinely interesting as a counterpoint to steel magic's more fluid approach. His first Wingardium Leviosa produced a feather that went up, hovered, and then drifted toward the window with a kind of serene indifference to the specific outcome he'd intended, which Flitwick corrected with delighted urgency. His second attempt was better. His third was better still, and by the fourth the feather was doing exactly what he asked, which Flitwick declared exceptional and Harry accepted politely while privately noting that the reason for the rapid improvement was that he was learning to let the wand do the work rather than adding his own intention to it, which was the opposite problem from steel magic, where intention was everything. He mentioned this to Hermione after class. "You're approaching the wand as a different instrument," she said, "not a worse or better one. That's why you're adapting quickly." "What's interesting," he said, "is that they're solving the same problem from different directions. The wand externalized the intention into a medium that interfaces with ambient magic. Steel magic internalizes the process entirely. But the underlying physics are the same, you're always working with the same material." Hermione stopped walking. "You said the underlying physics are the same," she said. "Yes. Which means a sufficiently advanced practitioner in either tradition should be able to understand the other one from first principles." "In theory," he said. "Give me the passage," she said. "From the book. The one you said you'd give me when I was ready." He looked at her. He thought about her 14-point critique of his preliminary passage. He thought about the architectural diagram on the library table. He thought about what Mara said once, "The best students are the ones who don't need you to decide when they're ready. They decide for themselves and then they prove it." He reached into his bag and pulled out Mara's manuscript and extracted a single page, a dense page, Czech and Latin and a hand-drawn diagram of energy vectors, and handed it to her. She took it. She read it standing in the middle of the corridor while students flowed around them and Ron appeared from behind and looked over her shoulder and said, "What language is that?" And she said, "Two languages, stop breathing on my neck," without looking up. Harry waited. She read it through once. Then she turned it over, confirmed there was nothing on the back, and turned it face up again. Her lips moved slightly. Then she said, "The vector diagram on the right is wrong." Harry blinked. "What?" "It's wrong," she said. "Or, not wrong, but incomplete. The diagram shows energy moving from external source to practitioner in a single direction flow, but if the practitioner can also redirect what they absorb, then the vector system needs a return path. A loop, not a line. The absence of the return vector makes it look like the energy just accumulates, which would be unsustainable and also dangerous." Harry looked at the page. He thought about what Mara had said about the return path, that she deliberately simplified the diagram for early learning because the full vector system was confusing before you'd felt it physically. "You're right," he said. Hermione looked up. "Seriously?" "Mara simplified it intentionally," he said. "The full diagram is in a later chapter. You've just independently identified the gap she put there on purpose." Hermione absorbed this. Something lit up in her expression, not pride exactly, though pride was in there, more like the specific satisfaction of a machine running at the correct voltage. The feeling of being fully used. "Then I want the full chapter," she said. "You can have it," he said. Ron, who had been looking between them throughout this exchange, said, "Are we all friends now? It feels like we might all be friends now." "We were always going to be friends," Harry said. "How did you know that?" "Train," Harry said simply. Ron thought about this for a moment. Then he nodded, satisfied, and they kept walking. The night Harry chose for his first reconnaissance of the vault was a Tuesday, 3 weeks into term, during which the castle was hosting what Peeves had announced at dinner would be the most spectacular poltergeist performance of the decade, which had caused McGonagall to look at the ceiling with the expression of someone having a theological crisis. Harry left the common room at 11, which was 3 hours after curfew, and moved through the castle with the practiced ease of someone who had been reading its patterns for 3 weeks and knew that the second-floor patrol was never actually second floor, always first, because the patrolling prefect had a detour to the kitchens that they thought nobody knew about. He wore dark clothes and moved with the low, quiet efficiency that Selina had drilled into him on rooftops and in corridors and across 3 years of Gotham's educational geography. No spell, no cloak, no enchantment, just the discipline of making yourself part of the room's natural shadow, becoming the thing the eye slid past without registering. He went down through the dungeons. The enchantments thickened as he descended, which was what he'd expected, the security layers announcing themselves the way a combination lock's weight changed as you approached the correct number. He passed Snape's classroom, the potion storage corridor, the door that led to the Slytherin common room, and then further, to a section of wall that was stone and apparently unbroken. He stood in front of it and put his hand against the stone. It was warm. Not room temperature warm. Warm. The concentrated magical attention of something that had been held in a state of active enchantment for a very long time, the stone itself saturated to a depth of several inches. He could feel the layers, 1, 2, 3, and then the faintest impression of a fourth, and below that the deep, dense signature of the vault itself, like looking down through clear water and seeing the floor further than you'd expected. He pressed his hand flat and extended his attention the way Mara had taught him, not pushing through the magic but into it, the way you read Braille, following the texture rather than trying to force meaning from the surface. The first layer was mechanical. A lock in the stone, complex, the kind of mechanism that required a specific magical key and would resist standard unlocking charms. He noted its construction and moved on. The second layer was detection, an awareness charm designed to register magical contact and alert someone. This was the one he had to be careful with. He'd known it would be here, detection was the universal second layer for any serious security. He kept his exploration passive, not reaching but sensing, moving around the edge of the charm the way you moved around a motion sensor's field. The third layer was the interesting one. It was alive. Not alive the way Hogwarts was alive, not the aggregate intelligence of enchantment sustained over centuries. This was the deliberate, specific aliveness of a creature, something that had been placed rather than built, and it was large. He could feel the heat of it from here, muffled through the stone and the previous layers like a voice through a thick door. He withdrew carefully, pulling his attention back the way you pulled a hand from a hot surface, smoothly and without hurry so as not to trigger the detection layer. He stood in the dark corridor and thought. 3 layers confirmed. 4th layer possible. Creature of significant size on the 3rd. Detection charm on the 2nd would need to be either circumvented or temporarily suppressed, doable, but it required preparation, and the suppression of a detection charm was a steel magic technique that cost something, which meant he needed to plan for the cost. The mechanical lock was actually the easiest part. He stood there for another minute, cataloging, planning, feeling the shape of the problem the way he felt the shape of any locked space. Then he heard footsteps. Not patrol footsteps were regular, purposeful, slightly heavy with the weight of authority. These were different. Careful. Familiar, almost, in the way of someone who also knew how to move quietly, which was a distinct alarm. He pressed himself into the shadow of a wall joint and waited. Quirrell came around the corner. Not the shuffling, nervous Quirrell of the classroom. This Quirrell moved differently in the dark, the stutter absent, the movements precise and deliberate, the purple turban slightly unwound at one corner as though it had come loose during effort. He walked to the exact section of wall Harry had just been examining and stood in front of it and put his hand against the stone. Harry watched from the shadows. He kept his attention carefully leashed, no reaching, no sensing, minimal magical presence, the most aggressive form of stillness he knew. Quirrell stood against the wall for almost 2 minutes. Whatever he was doing, it was costing him. His shoulders had the particular set of someone doing something difficult and sustained, and when he finally pulled away there was a small, sharp exhalation that wasn't quite pain and wasn't quite satisfaction. The doubled presence was very strong now. The second thing in Quirrell was interested in the vault. Deeply, urgently interested. Quirrell turned and walked back the way he'd come, and Harry waited 60 full seconds before he breathed normally and moved. He took the stairs back up to the ground floor and then the castle's winding route back to Gryffindor Tower, and he turned the night's information over in his mind with the focused attention of someone assembling a picture from its individual pieces. The vault had a timeline now. Quirrell, whatever was riding Quirrell, was also trying to get in. Which meant Harry didn't just have a target. He had competition. He wrote, in his notebook before he slept, 3 layers confirmed. Creature on layer 3, large. Quirrell is trying to access the vault independently. This changes the schedule. Original plan, winter break. New consideration, sooner, before he gets further. He closed the notebook and lay back on his bed and looked at the ceiling. Pick, on her perch, looked at him with her amber eyes. I know, he said. I'm thinking. She made her small, private sound. I'll be careful, he said. The troll was on October 31st, which Harry had not planned but was, in retrospect, a gift. He was in the Great Hall at the feast when Professor Quirrell came running in and announced the troll in a manner that was either genuine panic or an extremely committed performance, and within 60 seconds the hall was chaos, students being directed to dormitories, professors moving in 3 directions at once, the headmaster's eyes sharp beneath the twinkling calm. Harry stood in the surge of students moving toward the doors and he made a calculation in the space of about 4 seconds. Quirrell had used the announcement to leave the hall before any professor. Harry had tracked him, habit by now, and the direction Quirrell had taken when the teachers dispersed was not toward the dungeons, where a real troll sighting would have sent a defense professor. It was toward the 3rd-floor corridor. The misdirection within a misdirection, Quirrell had arranged the troll, and now he was going to use the chaos to get past the 3rd-floor defenses while every professor was occupied. Harry turned against the flow of students. Ron grabbed his arm. Harry, wrong way, go to the common room, Harry said. If anyone asks where I am, you don't know. Which will be true. Ron looked at him with the expression of someone who had decided, somewhere in the last 3 weeks, that following this particular person's lead was more interesting than safety. Or, Ron said, you could tell me what's actually happening and I could decide for myself. Harry looked at him. He thought, this is the kind of person I want to know. Quirrell arranged the troll, he said. He's going to use the chaos to get into the 3rd-floor corridor. I'm going to see what he does. Ron's ears went pink, not with embarrassment but with something else. Decision, maybe. Right, he said. Let's go then. You don't have to, I'm not a liability, Ron said, which was true and which Harry hadn't said, but which Ron had clearly said to himself enough times to feel the need to establish. I know the castle better than you do. I grew up hearing about it from my brothers. A beat. Fair point, Harry said. Come on. They went up. Hermione was in the 2nd-floor corridor, frozen in the middle of it with her wand out and her face doing the rapid calculation of someone running several threat assessments simultaneously. She saw Harry and said, the troll went up, not down. It's on the 2nd floor. Where on the 2nd floor? Harry said. She pointed. The girls' bathroom at the end of the corridor was, apparently, where the troll had gone. Harry could hear it from here, a sound like furniture being rearranged by someone who objected to furniture's existence. He could also feel, faint through the stone, several floors up and slightly northwest, Quirrell's magical presence, the doubled wrongness of him moving through the 3rd-floor defenses. Bathroom, Harry said. He looked at Hermione. Did you go in there? I was in there when the announcement came, she said, with the brittle composure of someone who had been recently frightened and was performing normality over it. I got out when I heard it but my bag is still inside. "Stay here," Harry said, and went in. The troll was approximately 12 feet of consolidated obstruction, which Harry assessed in the quarter-second before it noticed him and turned with the unhurried certainty of something that had never had a reason to hurry. Club the size of a small tree. Eyes like drain holes. The smell was a physical presence. Harry put his back to the wall and let the troll take a full step toward him before he did anything, because the first rule of any confrontation was know what you're dealing with before you commit, and commitment in the wrong direction was more dangerous than the thing you were dealing with. The troll swung. Harry moved, not dramatically, just efficiently, 2 steps to the left, placing the swing's end arc between him and the far wall. The club hit the wall and plaster rained. The troll turned, slower than it moved on instinct, and Harry extended his attention toward the enchantment that had been used to direct the creature here. It was still live. A guiding charm, faint but present, originating from outside the bathroom and running through the troll like a leash. He could feel the thread of it, thin and purposeful. He took hold of it. This was the core of steel magic in its most practical application, finding the magical thread in something and taking it over, not dispelling it but redirecting it, which was the difference between removing an arrow and turning it. He could feel the charm structure as he pulled it into himself, the slightly rough texture of something Quirrell had cast in a hurry, and he redirected it. The troll stopped. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would have been visible to anyone who didn't know what to look for. It just oriented differently. The internal direction that had been pointing it toward the bathroom turned 45 degrees, and the troll, following its internal compass with the profound trust of something that had never questioned where its instincts came from, turned and walked toward the far wall and then stood there, pressing its nose against it, no longer interested in anything else. Harry let the charm dissolve. Ron, who had appeared in the doorway during the last 30 seconds of this and had clearly been watching, said, "What did you just do?" "Redirected a guiding charm," Harry said, already moving back toward the door. "Quirrell put the troll here on purpose. He's upstairs." Ron looked at the troll, which was still pressing its nose against the wall with the focused enthusiasm of something that had found a new calling. "Yeah, all right," he said. He looked at Harry. "That was brilliant." "It was practical," Harry said. Hermione had come to the doorway. She looked at the troll and then at Harry and then at the troll again. "You redirected the guiding charm," she said. "Yes." "How did you?" She stopped. She was looking at his hands. He'd held them out when he worked the charm, fingers spread, which was the most natural position for steel magic contact and also visible. "The manuscript," she said. "The energy vector. You did that." "I do it regularly," he said. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read. It had several components, and they were competing. "I want to know everything," she said, which was more naked and direct than she usually let herself be, and he thought probably the troll and the fright had worn through her composure somewhat. "I know," he said. "Come on. We need to get back before someone finds us here." They went, up the stairs, away from the troll bathroom, back into the castle's flow of controlled chaos, 3 people navigating the dark corridor with the practiced ease of people who had each, for different reasons, spent time learning to move without being seen. Harry let the others get slightly ahead and he extended his attention one more time upward, toward the 3rd floor, where Quirrell had gone. The doubled presence had retreated. Whatever Quirrell had attempted tonight, he hadn't gotten through. Harry couldn't tell whether that was because the defenses had held or because the chaos hadn't given him enough time, but the result was the same, the vault was still sealed. For now. Harry filed the information and kept walking. He thought about Quirrell's urgency at the wall, the sustained effort, the quiet exhalation after. Whatever was riding him wanted inside that vault badly, and was willing to use a mountain troll as a distraction to get there. That was not patience. That was desperation with a plan layered over it. Harry preferred to be the one who was patient. He had time. He had information. And now he had, whether he'd precisely planned for it or not, 2 people who were going to help him whether they'd fully committed to that yet or not. He caught up to Ron and Hermione at the top of the stairs and they walked back toward Gryffindor Tower together, none of them speaking, but the silence had the quality of three people who had just been in something together and were each quietly deciding what that meant. In the common room, Percy Weasley appeared and delivered a short, furious address about curfew violations and irresponsibility, and Harry listened to it with the patient attention of someone letting weather pass, and when Percy finished, Harry said, "Thank you, Percy," with such perfect sincerity that Percy seemed to deflate slightly, robbed of the argument he'd been building toward. Ron caught Harry's eye across the common room and pressed his mouth together to keep from laughing. Hermione said, quietly, as they headed toward the stairs, "Tomorrow morning. Library. I want to discuss the full vector system." 7 o'clock, Harry said. 6:30, she said. 6:30, he agreed. He went upstairs and sat on his bed and took out his notebook and wrote one line, "Quirrell tried the third floor tonight. Failed. Timeline is active." He closed the notebook and put it under his pillow and lay back and looked at the ceiling and thought about his mother's magic in a glass vial somewhere below the foundations of this castle, preserved like something in a museum, like something that didn't have a rightful owner. He thought, not for long. The castle hummed around him in the dark, full of secrets and enchantments and the sleeping weight of 1,000 years of children who had grown up here, been shaped here, left parts of themselves in the walls. His mother was one of those children. Her hands had touched these same stones. Her magic had lived inside this same old air. He was going to take it home. Chapter 4, What Dumbledore Keeps. The second time Harry went down to the vault, he got past the first layer. It was a Saturday in mid-November, the castle quiet in the way of a Saturday morning after a week of hard weather that had kept everyone inside and irritable. The Quidditch pitch was waterlogged and practice had been cancelled, which meant half of Gryffindor was sleeping in, and the other half was in the common room cultivating the specific lethargy of people who had nowhere to be. Harry had been awake since 5. He went down through the dungeons alone this time, moving with the particular patience of someone who had spent 2 weeks preparing for a specific 30-minute window. He knew the patrol schedule. He knew the second detection layer's passive range, which he'd spent 4 evenings mapping from the outside without triggering it. And he'd spent 3 mornings at dawn in the 4th-floor bathroom, which had a particular quality of ambient magical silence that made it ideal, practicing the suppression technique Mara had described in Chapter 9 of the manuscript, the one Hermione had read twice and annotated extensively and described as theoretically elegant and practically terrifying. The first layer was a mechanical lock in the stone. He'd assessed it twice already. It was complex, 7-tumbler magical mechanism, designed to require a specific wand signature, the kind of thing that was supposed to be impassable without the corresponding key. Supposed to be. Harry put his hand against the stone and found the tumblers. They were there the way they always were, the faint, distinct resistance of each mechanism, the particular signature of a lock that had been made to a specific magical frequency. He didn't try to match Dumbledore's wand signature. That would take time. He didn't have an effort that would leave traces. Instead he found the tumbler that was looser than the others. There was always a loose tumbler. Mechanical entropy was universal across all locking systems, magical or otherwise, and the 7-tumbler mechanism had its weakest point in the 5th, and he worked from there. 3 minutes. The stone shifted. Not dramatically, no rumble, no cinematic revelation. A section of wall that had been seamlessly stone was now a seam, a vertical line of shadow, a door. Harry pushed it and it opened into a staircase going down. He felt the second layer immediately. The detection charm sat in the air of the staircase like fog, not visible, not audible, but present in the way of something that had an opinion about his being there and was preparing to express it. He stopped on the top step and closed his eyes. The suppression technique was precise and uncomfortable. It required him to extend his awareness into the charm structure and create an interference pattern, not dispelling the charm, which would leave evidence, but generating a counter-frequency in the surrounding magic that made him, for the period he could sustain it, essentially inaudible to the detection layer. Like matching the pitch of a sound exactly, both tones cancelled each other and produced silence. The effort was internal, invisible from the outside, and it felt like holding a muscle flex in a specific configuration while also walking, possible but costing. He could sustain it for approximately 8 minutes. He'd practiced to 10 and collapsed twice, which Mara's notes had described as expected. He'd felt unreasonably validated by this. He started down the stairs. The staircase was short, only about 30 steps, and it opened into a corridor that was unlike the rest of Hogwarts. The castle above had the warmth of long habitation, the accumulated magical personality of thousands of students over centuries. This was older and colder and entirely deliberate, an architecture not of education but of containment. The walls were closely fitted stone without mortar, the ceiling low, the floor dry and even. The enchantments in the walls here were not school standard, they were something considerably more personal, specifically constructed rather than institutionally layered, and they had Dumbledore's signature in them the way a letter had handwriting. Harry moved quietly down the corridor, maintaining the suppression, counting his minutes. At the end of the corridor was the third layer. He'd felt it from the dungeons above. Up close it was considerably more impressive. The door, and it was a door here, actual wood reinforced with iron brackets, though the iron had been enchanted to the point where calling it iron was almost a courtesy, had the particular quality of something that knew it was being looked at. The creature behind it was not visible but its presence was not subtle, the heat, the breathing that he could feel in the floor rather than hear, the sense of massive, patient attention. He stood 6 feet from the door and looked at it. He could feel all 5 layers now. The mechanical lock behind him. The detection charm on the stairs. The creature here. And beyond the door, faint but distinct, 2 more layers, something he couldn't fully identify from this position, but the signatures were complex, the kind of complex that took time and intent. 8 minutes. He'd used almost 4 getting here. He didn't try the door. That had never been part of tonight's plan, tonight was reconnaissance, not entry. He extended his attention toward the door with the careful, measured reach of someone not trying to open a lock but to understand it, feeling the construction of the barrier rather than its strength, the way you ran your hand over a surface to understand its texture before deciding how to work it. The enchantments on the door were layered in a specific sequence that told him something important, they'd been modified recently. Within the last 6 weeks, the magical equivalent of fresh paint, the spells still settling into their final configuration. Someone had added to the protections after the beginning of term. After Harry had arrived. He stood with that information for a moment. Then he counted his minutes, 6 gone, and turned and went back up the staircase with the same careful control, maintaining the suppression until he was through the stone door and it had sealed behind him, and then he let the technique go and stood in the dungeon corridor and let the tension dissolve from his jaw and his hands. He stood very still for a moment, breathing. The suppressant cost was a specific kind of tired, not physical, not exactly magical, but somewhere between the two, the particular depletion of something that had been held at sustained tension. He'd need an hour before he felt fully sharp again. He'd planned for that, breakfast, normal Saturday, nothing that required him to be at his best. He went upstairs. He told Hermione on Sunday, in the library, quietly, with his notebook open between them and her annotated copy of Mara's Chapter 9 on the table to his left. She listened without interrupting, which was not her natural state but which she developed as a discipline over the last month of these conversations, because she'd learned that Harry gave information in the order that made logical sense rather than the order that satisfied immediate curiosity, and interrupting disrupted the structure. When he finished she said, "The modifications to the protections. After you arrived." "Yes. He knows you're here for it." "He suspected before I arrived," Harry said. "The vault modifications confirm it. He doesn't know how much I know or whether I have the capability to get past the layers, but he knows my intention." "Which means what, practically?" "It means the timeline is tighter than it was," Harry said. "Quirrell is attempting the vault independently, the protections have been strengthened, and Dumbledore is now aware enough to be watching." He turned his quill over between his fingers. "It also means that when I take the vial, the conversation with Dumbledore afterward is going to be different." Hermione looked at him steadily. You're planning a conversation with Dumbledore after you take it. I'm planning for everything, he said. That's not the same as answering my question. He looked at her. The vial is my mother's, he said. I want it back and I'm going to take it back. But I don't want to take it and disappear. I want Dumbledore to understand why, and I want him to have to say out loud that what he did was wrong. A pause. That matters to me. Hermione was quiet for a moment. The library was Sunday quiet around them, the morning light slanting through the high windows onto old wood and older paper. Why does him saying it matter? Because it happened to my mother, Harry said. Because she died and someone went to her house before the body was cold and took something that was hers and filed it as a strategic resource. And the person who did it has been making decisions about what's good for the wizarding world for 50 years without anyone asking him to account for the decisions. He said it all without raising his voice, without any of the heat that Hermione had seen in other people talking about injustice. Just the clean, cold clarity of a conclusion reached through evidence. He needs to be accountable to someone. Even if it's only once. Even if it's only me. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, I'll help you. He looked up. Not everything, she said. Not yet. But the research. The additional layers, I want to understand what they are before you go in again. If there's something dangerous in there I'd rather we knew about it in advance than discovered it while you're 6 floors underground. You've been doing the research anyway, he said. I've been doing architectural research, she said. This is different. This is deliberate. She said it like someone signing a document. Hermione. What? Thank you, he said. She pressed her lips together and looked at her notes. Don't thank me yet. I have 14 follow-up questions and at least 3 of them are going to be annoying. I can manage 14. Good. First one, the Chapter 9 suppression technique. Mara writes that sustained application beyond personal magical capacity causes temporary systemic disruption. She found the line in her notes, which she describes as, quote, rather unpleasant and entirely survivable, which is the bar I set for acceptable training outcomes. What does systemic disruption actually mean? It means you go sideways for about 20 minutes, Harry said. Define sideways. Dizzy, slightly unable to feel where your hands are, one occasion where I was briefly convinced the floor was a different texture than it was. He paused. Mara found it educational. Mara sounds dangerous, Hermione said. She's extraordinary, Harry said. Those aren't mutually exclusive, Hermione said, which was an exact echo of what Ron had said on the train about her, which Harry appreciated and filed. The owl from Selina arrived on a Wednesday, carried by a compact gray city pigeon rather than an owl, because Selina considered owls operationally conspicuous and had spent 3 years training a network of Gotham City pigeons to carry messages, which Pick regarded as deeply undignified and which Harry found both practical and characteristic. The message was short, in the compressed notation they'd developed over years of correspondence. Heard from M, says the shard question is more complicated than she told you. Wants to talk. Can get to H adjacent location. Say when. Harry read it twice, folded it, and held it. The shard question was Mara's terminology for the fragment of Voldemort that Harry had been carrying since he was 1 year old, the piece of the killing curse that his infant steel magic had absorbed rather than succumbed to. Mara had told him about it when he was 13, carefully and without drama, in the Prague kitchen with coffee between them and the afternoon light going orange through the old windows. She'd said, you carry something that isn't yours, and we need to discuss what to do about it eventually. Eventually was apparently now. He wrote back to Selina that evening, Hogsmeade. First weekend in December. Tell M. He looked at the reply for a moment after he'd written it. He turned the possibility over in his mind that the thing in Dumbledore's vault and the thing inside himself were connected, were parts of the same problem, the same night's events, different manifestations of what happened when a killing curse met a steel magic practitioner at 1 year old and both of them survived. He thought about the hat saying, in that dry, old voice, your theory is correct. He folded the message and gave it to the pigeon and went back to his Transfiguration essay, which he'd left half-finished and which was due Thursday morning. Draco Malfoy found him alone in a corridor on Thursday afternoon. Not found exactly, the word implied an accident, and nothing about Malfoy was accidental in terms of placing himself in Harry's path. He'd been doing a version of this since the first week, orbiting Harry's periphery with the focused attention of someone who had decided something about a person and was waiting for confirmation. Harry had let him orbit. Draco was interesting in the way of someone with genuine intelligence that was being badly directed, like a precision instrument being used for a blunt task. There were no Crabbe and Goyle. That was the first notable thing. Draco had, apparently, come to this particular conversation alone. "Potter," he said. "Malfoy," Harry said, and stopped walking, because stopping was a choice and walking away was also a choice, and he was curious which direction this was going to go. Draco was quiet for a moment that had more in it than it appeared. "You're good at defense," he said. It was not what Harry had expected, which made it interesting. "Quirrell's not challenging," Harry said. "Not at defense class," Draco said, with a slight impatience. "I mean, I heard about Halloween. The troll." Harry said nothing. "People are saying you redirected the charm that was guiding it," Draco said. "Without a wand." "People are saying quite a few things," Harry said. "Are they wrong?" Harry looked at him. Draco had his chin slightly up, the defensive posture of someone who decided to be direct about something and was bracing for the possibility that directness was a mistake. His eyes were grey and sharp and right now entirely honest, which was not an expression Harry had seen on him before. "No," Harry said. Draco processed this. Something moved through his expression, not awe, which Harry would have found tedious, but something more complicated. "How?" "It's a discipline that predates wand tradition," Harry said. "I learned it outside Hogwarts." "There are things outside Hogwarts," Draco said, and it was not entirely a question. It had the inflection of someone revising a map, not discovering new territory, but correcting boundaries they'd been given wrongly. "There's a great deal outside Hogwarts," Harry said. "Most institutions aren't aware of what exists outside them. That's usually a feature, not a failure, it keeps the institution functional. But it means the people inside have an incomplete picture." Draco looked at him. "My father says Hogwarts is the best magical education in Europe." "Your father is probably working from a definition of best that serves his interests," Harry said, not unkindly. "Which is a thing that fathers do. Mine would have had opinions shaped by his circumstances too." "A beat." "Your father's dead," Draco said, and there was something in the way he said it, not cruel, but almost careful, like someone picking up a sharp thing, that suggested he was aware of the particular weight of dead fathers in this specific conversation. "Yes," Harry said. "Mine's," Draco stopped. Harry waited. "He has very clear ideas about what matters," Draco said finally. "And about who people should be. And he's usually right. About most things." "I believe you believe that," Harry said. Draco's jaw tightened. "What does that mean?" "It means you're 15 and he's your father and you've been in his orbit your whole life," Harry said. "That's not an insult. It's a context." He paused. "What did you actually come here to say?" Another silence, longer this time. Draco was looking at the floor and then the wall and then, with visible decision, at Harry. "My father wants me to report on you," he said. "What you're like. Whether you're what the Dark Lord's supporters should be concerned about." The air in the corridor did not change. Harry's expression did not change. He held Draco's gaze and kept his voice the same temperature it had been throughout the entire conversation. "And? I haven't," Draco said. "I've been writing him letters about coursework." A pause. "He's annoyed." "I imagine he is," Harry said. "I don't know why I'm telling you this," Draco said, with the baffled tone of someone whose own behavior had surprised them. Because you're smart enough to know that being useful to someone who's paying attention is better than being useful to someone who only wants confirmation of what they already believe, Harry said. Draco stared at him. I'm not recruiting you, Harry said. I'm not asking you for anything. You came here and told me something honest and I'm giving you honest back. He shifted his bag on his shoulder. What your father wants from you and what's actually good for you might be the same thing. They might not be. You're the one who's going to have to figure that out, not me. He started walking. After 2 steps he glanced back. Draco was still standing where he'd stopped, with the expression of someone whose careful internal architecture had just experienced something it hadn't been built for. Malfoy, Harry said. Draco looked up. The pre-wand texts aren't in the main library, Harry said. They're in the restricted section, in the Eastern Annex, 3rd shelf from the bottom. Madame Pants doesn't restrict access to the Annex specifically, only to individual texts. If you're curious. He paused. The reading is dense but you're clearly not stupid. He walked away and left Draco standing in the corridor and did not look back. The Mirror of Heist was on the 7th floor, in a room that was not on Hermione's architectural diagram and which Harry found by following the most concentrated absence of castle awareness he'd encountered since arriving at Hogwarts. He'd noticed it 3 weeks earlier, a dead spot in the castle's distributed enchantment attention, a room that the building seemed to be deliberately not acknowledging. That was, in Harry's experience, the most reliable indicator of something significant. The things worth finding were not the things that announced themselves. The room was accessible through a tapestry on the 7th floor corridor, behind which a door existed that had no lock and no detection charm and no creature, just the door, the room, and the mirror. He stood in front of it and looked at himself. The Mirror of Heist showed, according to Mara's notes and 3 separate historical accounts Harry had cross-referenced in the library's archive edition, the deepest, most desperate desire of the viewer. Most people saw themselves with things they wanted, fame, success, family, objects. Mara had noted in her margin, the mirror is a diagnostic tool for people who don't know themselves. For those who do, it is more complicated. Harry looked at his reflection. For a long moment he saw himself, just himself, the same face he saw every morning, the same dark hair and the same green eyes and the same scar that he'd stopped thinking about as exceptional around age 12 and now regarded as simply part of his face. Then the image shifted. His mother appeared first. He'd seen photographs, Mara had photographs, Selina had found some, so he knew the red hair and the particular brightness of those green eyes that were his eyes in a different face. She was standing beside him in the mirror, and beside her was his father, dark-haired and lanky with round glasses, and Harry looked at them and felt the thing he almost never let himself feel, the thing he'd been disciplined about for 10 years, the absence that had always been there and that he usually managed by keeping the management so thorough it didn't require attention. But there was something else in the mirror. Behind his parents, faint but distinct, Selina, leaning against nothing in the easy, self-contained way she stood in real life, her expression the one that she never fully explained, the one that meant I'd walk back into that house in Surrey 1,000 times. And behind Selina, visible only at the edges, Mara with her sharp dark eyes and her complicated smile. Harry stood in front of the mirror and looked at all of them and breathed slowly and didn't look away. He stood there for 4 minutes. He knew the mirror could trap people, he'd read the accounts of people who'd sat in front of it for days, unable to leave, feeding on the image the way starving people fed on anything available. He understood, looking at it, exactly how that happened. He understood it in the specific, embodied way of someone who was currently experiencing the pull. He took one more breath and turned away from the mirror. He stood with his back to it, looking at the wall. His hands were in his jacket pockets and his jaw was exactly level, and he stood still until the pull had the quality of something he'd acknowledged rather than something that was operating on him. Then he went to look at the room's floor. Because the room with the mirror was on the 7th floor, which was not one of the blank spaces on Hermione's architectural diagram. But the mirror was in it. And a mirror that showed desire was also, historically, a mirror that could be used to hide things from people who desired them. He crouched and put his hand on the floor. The enchantments here were dense and deliberate and absolutely Dumbledore's. Something was being kept in or around this mirror. Not the vault was sub-basement, deep below, but something else. Something that had been recently moved or recently placed. He stood up and looked at the mirror from behind. The frame had inscription on the back as well as the front, and the inscription was not the well-known desire reversal, that was the front. The inscription on the back was in Latin and much older and said, approximately, in the translation that came to him after a moment, I show you what you have not yet taken. He stared at that for a moment. Then he went and sat in the corner of the room, quite still, and he thought about it. If the mirror was configured to show what you had not yet taken, rather than what you most deeply desired, then to a sufficiently trained practitioner with a clearly defined goal, the mirror would show him not a wish but a target. Not an image of his mother but an image of the vial that contained her last magic. He stood back up and went in front of the mirror and looked at it differently. The image of his family was still there. But he looked past it, looked at the background of the image, the space behind the reflected figures, and there was the vial. Small. Glass. The color of the magic inside it was the specific green of his mother's eyes, a warm and living green rather than the cold killing curse green, and it was sitting on what appeared to be a stone shelf in a room with low ceilings and flagstone floors. The sub-basement. He was looking at the vault. I was wondering when you would find this room. Harry turned around. Dumbledore was standing in the doorway. He was wearing robes the color of deep water, and his half-moon spectacles caught the light in a way that was either accidental or precisely managed, and he was looking at Harry with an expression of absolute, benign attention, the performance of a grandfather who has caught a child somewhere they shouldn't be and is deciding to be gentle about it. The performance was excellent. Harry watched the performance and watched the man behind it simultaneously and felt, for the first time in a long while, the specific calibration that Selina had taught him for rooms with people who were genuinely good at this. Professor, Harry said. Harry, Dumbledore said. He walked into the room with the unhurried ease of someone in their own space. What do you see? My family, Harry said. Because it was true, and giving Dumbledore something true was both more honest and more strategically interesting than lying. Dumbledore looked at the mirror with the expression of someone who had stood in front of it many times and had long since arranged their relationship to what it showed them. It is a powerful object. Many have been trapped by it. I read about that, Harry said. You've done a great deal of reading, Dumbledore said, pleasantly. I grew up with good teachers, Harry said. Dumbledore looked at him. The warmth was still in his expression, it was genuine warmth, not fake warmth, which was what made Dumbledore genuinely complicated. He was not a man performing decency. He was a man whose decency was real and whose choices were made from it and who had somehow arrived at the conclusion that real decency sometimes required taking things from people without asking. I understand you had an unusual upbringing, Dumbledore said. It suited me, Harry said. You weren't placed where I intended, Dumbledore said. And there it was, stated simply and without apparent guilt, just information. I had a plan for you and you weren't in it. Harry held that. I know where you intended, he said. The Dursleys. The blood protection wouldn't have been worth what it cost, Harry said. I was in that house for 5 years. I know exactly what the Dursleys are. Something moved briefly through Dumbledore's expression, not guilt exactly, but a proximity to it, the expression of someone who had spent a long time not looking at a specific thing and was now being asked to look. You were found, he said. I was found, Harry agreed. By someone considerably better than what you intended. The room was quiet. The mirror stood between them, showing Harry his reflected family, and Dumbledore looked at Harry with eyes that were old and sharp and doing the same assessment that Harry was doing, two people in a room reading each other, each aware of the other's reading. You know about the vault, Dumbledore said. Yes, Harry said. And you came to Hogwarts to retrieve what belongs to me, Harry said. Yes. No alarm in Dumbledore's voice. No anger. He sat down on a chair that hadn't been there a moment ago, or that Harry hadn't noticed, and he looked at Harry with the expression of someone settling into a conversation they'd been considering for some time. "Your mother's magic," he said. "My mother's magic," Harry said. "I kept it because it was the most powerful example of sacrificial protection magic ever recorded," Dumbledore said. "The properties of what Lily did that night, the love-based protection she created, are not fully understood. Studying the magical residue has given us, have you ever considered," Harry said, pleasantly, "that the appropriate response to something that belonged to a woman who died would be to give it to her surviving child rather than to study it?" Silence. "I have considered it," Dumbledore said. "And?" "I decided that the greater good required." "You decided," Harry said. "Without asking me. Without acknowledging that it was mine to be asked about." He wasn't loud. He wasn't cold either, exactly, more the particular temperature of someone who had prepared for this conversation for a long time and was now having it without any of the fear or reverence that Dumbledore's position typically generated. "I'm not angry about it, Professor. Anger's not productive in this situation. But I want you to understand that you made a decision about my property, and my mother's legacy, and you made it without any reference to the fact that I existed and had a claim." Dumbledore looked at him for a long time. The half-moon spectacles caught the light. His hands were folded in his lap with the settled patience of someone who had conducted 10,000 difficult conversations and had learned to wait through all of them. "You are not," he said finally, "what I expected." "I know," Harry said. "May I ask, who taught you?" "The wandless magic, he paused, "the techniques you used with the troll on Halloween." "You knew about the troll," Harry said. "I know most things that happen in this castle," Dumbledore said, without apology. "A woman named Mara Voss," Harry said. "She teaches the pre-wand tradition. Steel magic." Something in Dumbledore's expression shifted. Not alarm, deeper than alarm, the expression of someone encountering information that rewrote something structural. "Mara Voss," he said, quietly. "She's still alive." "Extremely," Harry said. "I knew her, very briefly, when I was young," Dumbledore said. "She was already old then." He paused. "And the woman who took you from Surrey?" "That's not information I'll give you," Harry said, without any particular heat. Dumbledore nodded, as though this answer was expected and accepted. He looked at the mirror, then at Harry. "The vault has 5 protection layers," he said. "I know 4 of them," Harry said. "You've been past the mechanical lock and the detection suppression." He said it as information, confirming a timeline. "The creature on the 3rd layer, you know what it is?" "Large," Harry said. "Patient. Hot-blooded. My best guess from the thermal signature is a Cerberus variant, but the temperature's higher than the standard accounts suggest." "A 3-headed dog named Fluffy," Dumbledore said. "He belongs to a groundskeeper named Hagrid, who is under the impression that the vault contains a school experiment rather than anything of personal significance." A pause. "He has a weakness." Harry looked at him. "Music," Dumbledore said. "It sends him to sleep. Almost any melody." Harry held very still. He was being given the vault's vulnerabilities by the man who had built the vault's protections. He processed what that meant. "You're going to let me take it," Harry said. "I have been," Dumbledore said quietly, "considering this conversation for several weeks. Since you arrived, in fact, and it became clear that you were not the boy I'd spent 10 years preparing for but were instead something I hadn't accounted for." He looked at his hands. "I owe you a debt, Harry. Not only in terms of the vial. I made decisions about your life before you had any say in it, and while I believe those decisions were made with the best intentions, the road to Surrey," Harry said. "Yes." Something genuinely pained moved through Dumbledore's face. "The road to Surrey." He looked up. "The vial can be retrieved. I won't obstruct you." "And the other 4 layers?" "The 3rd will sleep if you hum something. He's partial to Beethoven, though in my experience any music with a clear melodic line works. A pause. The fourth and fifth layers are mine specifically and I will need to remove them. Before you go. Harry looked at him for a long moment. Two people in a room with a mirror between them, the castle old and attentive around them. There's something else, Harry said. Dumbledore went very still. The shard, Harry said. The piece of him that's been in me since I was 1 year old. You know about it. Dumbledore looked at him. For the first time in the entire conversation, his expression was not managed. It was the expression of a man confronting the cost of a decision he'd made a long time ago and had been not looking at since. Yes, he said. I know about it. Mara wants to discuss it, Harry said. She's coming to Hogsmeade in December. I should speak with Mara, Dumbledore said. The certainty in his voice was the certainty of someone saying something they should have done 10 years ago. Yes. I should speak with her. She'll enjoy that, Harry said, with the slight warmth of someone who knew exactly how Mara Voss conducted conversations with people who owed her information. Dumbledore looked at him and for a moment, just a moment, his expression was completely unguarded. Not the grandfather, not the headmaster, not the long-game strategist. Just a very old man looking at the son of two people he had failed and loved and failed again and was now, finally, being held accountable to by the one person who had the standing to do it. Your mother, Dumbledore said, would have been exceptional. She was exceptional. And she would have, he paused, choosing, she would have appreciated you. Harry held this. He didn't deflect it and he didn't let it break him open and he didn't perform a reaction. He just held it, in the quiet of the room with the mirror between them and the castle's old magic attending silently. I know, he said. He picked up his bag. Harry, Dumbledore said. Harry stopped. Quirrell, Dumbledore said. You know what he is. I know what he's carrying, Harry said. Yes. He has been trying to access the vault, Dumbledore said. The protections have held so far. But his patron is, not patient. The situation will resolve itself one way or another before the year is out. I intend to resolve it myself, Harry said. I was afraid of that, Dumbledore said. Were you? Harry said. No, Dumbledore admitted. Not really. Harry left the room with the mirror and walked back through the 7th-floor corridor with the castle humming under his feet and the evening light going gold through the high windows, and he thought about everything Dumbledore had said and everything he'd held back and the specific balance of truth and strategy in the conversation, and he found, to his own mild surprise, that the man was more interesting than he'd expected. Not better. Not absolved. But more genuinely complicated than the version he'd been carrying. He took the stairs 2 at a time down to the 3rd floor and went to dinner with Ron and Hermione, arriving between the soup and the main course, and Ron said, Where were you? And Harry said, 7th floor, and Ron said, What's on the 7th floor? And Harry said, I'll tell you later, and Ron, who had developed a reliable instinct for which laters were real and which were indefinite deferrals, said, Tonight, after dinner, and Harry said, Yes. Hermione, across from them, had looked up when Harry sat down. She looked at his face with the attention she gave anything important and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, You talked to him. In a manner of speaking, Harry said. How did it go? Harry thought about the mirror. About his mother's red hair and his father's glasses. About Selina leaning against nothing. About Dumbledore's face when it was, for one moment, unguarded. He's going to clear the 4th and 5th layers, Harry said. Hermione stared at him. Ron stared at him. At the staff table, Quirrell was eating with the focused, inward attention of someone occupied with something internal. Dumbledore was looking at his goblet. Hermione said. He agreed, Harry said. After a conversation. What did you say? Harry picked up his fork. I told him the truth, he said. And I let him tell me some of his. He paused. The dog on the third layer is named Fluffy. He likes Beethoven. Ron blinked. Then, slowly, a grin spread across his freckled face. He told you the dog's name. He told me the dog's name, Harry confirmed. Ron looked at Hermione. Hermione looked at Harry. Harry ate his dinner. All right, Ron said, picking up his own fork with the settled satisfaction of someone who had decided to simply trust the process and enjoy the ride. All right then. The pigeon arrived 3 days later from Selina, confirms December 8, Hogsmeade. The tea place on the north corner, she says you'll know it, and if you don't, you haven't been paying attention. Harry wrote back, I know it. Tell her I've already looked at the building. The pigeon took the message and left, and Pick watched it go from her perch with the expression of someone who had opinions about working-class birds being given professional responsibilities. Don't, Harry told her. Pick ruffled her feathers with great dignity and looked away. He sat at the dormitory window with the castle dark outside and the ground silver with early December frost, and he thought about December 8th, and Mara, and the shard question, the thing that was both his and not his, the piece of Voldemort that had lived in him for 15 years because a 1-year-old steel magic instinct had grabbed the wrong thing and held on. He thought about what it meant that Dumbledore had said, your theory is correct. And he thought about what it meant that Mara had sent a message saying the situation was more complicated than she'd told him. More complicated than you have a piece of Voldemort inside you was a fairly high bar for complication. He looked at the frost on the grounds and thought, whatever it is, I'll deal with it. That was not bravado. It was just the fundamental, settled fact of someone who had been prepared, carefully and by people who loved him with precision, for exactly this kind of complication. Whatever it was, he would deal with it. The castle hummed around him in the dark. Something in the walls that was not quite sound and not quite feeling, the particular resonance of old magic attending to someone in whom it recognized itself. Harry closed the window and went to bed. Chapter 5, The Thief Queen's lesson. Hogsmeade on a December Saturday was cold enough to make the air feel structural, like something you could lean against. The village had gone thoroughly seasonal, frost on every roof edge, smoke from every chimney, the kind of collective coziness that happened when communities got cold together and decided to make a thing of it. Students from third year and above moved between the shops in loud, mittened clusters. The sky was the flat, even white of snow that hadn't decided yet. Harry left the castle at 8 in the morning, 3 hours before the official Hogsmeade trip began. He went through the passage behind the one-eyed witch's hump on the 3rd floor. He'd found it in his 2nd week, because the castle's deliberate blankness around that particular statue was the same kind of absence as signal as the mirror's room, and he'd followed it out of interest and found the tunnel with the professional satisfaction of a locksmith finding a door they'd suspected was there. The tunnel came out in the cellar of Honeydukes, which smelled aggressively of sugar and was otherwise very useful. He came up through the trapdoor and through the shop. The Honeydukes staff were busy with delivery crates in the back, and he moved through the front with the practiced ease of someone who had grown up doing this, and out onto the village street. The tea place on the north corner was called, in the muted lettering above its door, Katarina's, which was a Czech name in a Scottish village, which meant it had been named by someone who wasn't pretending to be local, which meant it was exactly the kind of place Mara Voss would know. Harry pushed open the door. The interior was warm and close and smelled of black tea and something spiced, and the walls were lined with the kind of miscellaneous objects that accumulated in places run by people who collected things that interested them rather than things that matched. Mara was at a table in the back corner, facing the door, which she always was, everywhere, because Mara had not survived 60-something years by sitting with her back to entrances. She looked exactly the same as she always did, which was to say, like someone who had made a private agreement with time and was keeping the terms. The dark eyes, the layered clothing, the particular stillness of someone who was never between things but was always, specifically, doing the current thing completely. Selina was beside her. Harry stopped for half a second, because he hadn't known Selina would be here. The message had said Mara, December 8th, and then he moved again and crossed the room and Selina caught him in the brief, complete embrace of someone who had been performing, not missing him for 3 months and was briefly done performing. You're taller, she said, into the top of his head. You say that every time, he said. Every time it's true, she said, and let him go with the precise timing of someone who had never once lingered past the moment something was done. He sat down across from Mara. She looked at him with those sharp dark eyes the way she always looked at him, not checking, exactly, more like tuning, the way you tuned an instrument you used regularly to make sure it was still set right. You look well, she said. I am well, he said. You've been inside the vault's approach corridor, she said. To the third layer, he said. And Dumbledore has agreed to remove the fourth and fifth. Mara's eyebrows moved fractionally. You spoke to Dumbledore. Last week. How was he? Complicated, Harry said. Genuinely complicated, not performed complicated. He's running 4 or 5 games simultaneously and at least 2 of them conflict with each other. He usually is, Mara said. I knew him, briefly, when he was young. He mentioned that, Harry said. Something flickered in Mara's expression. Did he? Not a question. She reached for her tea and held the cup in both hands with the focused quiet of someone who was deciding how to begin something. The shard, she said. You said the situation was more complicated than you told me, Harry said. It is. She put the cup down. I told you at 13 that you were carrying a fragment of Voldemort's soul. That much is accurate. What I did not tell you, because I did not understand it fully at the time and because I needed to research further before I could be responsible about it, is what the fragment is doing. What is it doing? Harry said. Deteriorating, Mara said. But not in the direction you'd expect. Harry waited. When the killing curse made contact with you in 1981, Mara said, in her precise, unhurried way, the voice she used for things she'd thought about carefully, your steel magic instinct responded the way it responds to any directed magical force, it attempted to absorb and redirect. In a 1-year-old with no training and no framework, the absorption was partial and the redirection was impossible. So the curse fragmented. Most of it deflected, that's the scar, the feedback, what Voldemort lost his body over. But a piece of the curse was absorbed fully. And a piece of a killing curse is a piece of the soul behind it. I know this part, Harry said. The part you don't know, Mara said, is that the fragment has been in contact with your steel magic for 15 years. And your steel magic, which is not passive, it's a living practice, a fundamental part of how you interface with the world, has been doing to the fragment what it does to everything it contacts. Selina was very still beside Mara. It's been absorbing it, Harry said. Slowly, Mara said. Over 15 years. The fragment is not whole. It's been, digested, is perhaps the word, though I find it unpleasant. Your magic has been breaking down the foreign element piece by piece and integrating the raw energy rather than the personality. The soul fragment is losing coherence. Harry sat with this. How much of it is left? My best estimate, based on readings I've done over the years and what Dumbledore has apparently separately detected, yes, I've been corresponding with him since October, before you ask, she looked at him steadily, is that the fragment is perhaps 30% of what it was in 1981. The remaining 30% is still coherent enough to function as a fragment. And when it's completely gone? Harry said. Then you'll have processed 15 years of Tom Riddle's magical energy through your own system, Mara said, which will leave traces in your capacity but not in your personality. You are not becoming him. You are digesting him. There is a significant difference. Harry nodded. He was processing, arranging the information into its proper structural relation to everything else he knew. Does Voldemort know? He said. Almost certainly not, Mara said. The connection that allows him to occasionally reach through the fragment, the nightmares, the emotional bleed, is weakening as the fragment weakens. By my estimate, within 2 to 3 years it will be gone entirely. And if he tries to use the connection before it's gone? Harry said. Mara's expression told him the answer before she spoke it. Then he will encounter not a passive anchor but an active steel magic practitioner who has spent 15 years inadvertently strengthening himself on his own magical energy. She paused. That is not a position I would recommend for him. Selina said, quietly, this is why you needed to see him in person. Reading aloud from a letter felt inadequate, Mara said. Harry looked at his hands on the table. He thought about the dreams he'd had occasionally, sharp, violent things that tasted of someone else's fury, that he'd always been able to pull himself out of with the technique Mara had taught him for separating his own magical state from external influences. He thought about the connection he'd sometimes felt in his scar, faint, like a radio signal from a very far station. Getting fainter, over the years. He'd been winning without knowing he was playing. There's something else, Mara said. Of course there is, Harry said. When the fragment is gone entirely, Mara said, you will have, not his memories. Not his skills. But something of his magical architecture. The structure of how very powerful, very old magic organizes itself. You've been living alongside it for 15 years and your own magic has been building in parallel with it. You are going to be, she paused, choosing her word with the care she gave to important ones, considerable. I'm already considerable, Harry said. More considerable, Mara said, with the slight warmth of someone who finds an accurate statement of confidence endearing rather than arrogant. And in ways that are difficult to predict. Do you need me to be concerned about this? Harry said. No, Mara said. I need you to know it. All right, Harry said. I know it. He picked up his tea. Now. The vault. Mara looked at Selina. Selina looked at Harry with the expression she wore when she'd been preparing herself for something and was now doing the something. Tell me the layers, Mara said. He told her. All 5, including the information Dumbledore had given him about the 3rd layer and the commitment to clear the 4th and 5th. Mara listened without interrupting, which meant she didn't need clarification, which meant she was tracking everything on the first pass, which was simply Mara. When he finished she said, the 2nd layer. You've been using Chapter 9's suppression technique. Yes. How long can you sustain it? Confirmed 8 minutes. Train to 10. The distance from the 1st layer to the 3rd layer, you timed it at under 4 minutes on your first entry. 3 minutes 40 seconds, Harry said. Then you have margin, Mara said. But the suppression will have depleted you partially before you reach the 3rd layer. Can you sustain the technique and conduct the 3rd layer engagement simultaneously? Harry thought about this honestly. If the engagement is passive, he said. Music to put the dog to sleep, that's non-magical, it doesn't draw from the same reserve. So yes. Mara nodded. I want to run a practical session before you go in, she said. Here. Harry said. Where else? She looked around the tea shop with the expression of someone who found the question mildly amusing. Go lock the door. Harry looked at her. He looked at Selina, who had the expression of someone who had seen this before and found it equally alarming and wonderful. He got up and went to the door and turned the bolt and came back and sat down. Give me your hands, Mara said. He held them out, palms up, across the table. She took them in both of hers. Her hands were small and warm and always had a slight electrical quality to them, the ambient steel magic of someone who had been doing it for decades, and she closed her eyes. He felt it almost immediately. The assessment, Mara's attention moving through him the way it always did, familiar but never quite the same twice because he was never quite the same twice, and today she went deeper than she usually did, past the surface capacity and into the structural, following the pathways that connected his conscious practice to his deeper reserves with the focused attention of someone tracing pipes. She found the fragment. He felt her find it, felt her attention pause there, in the way it paused at anything unexpected, and he held still and let her look. The fragment was, as she described, less than it had been. He could feel it himself when he reached for it deliberately, which he rarely did, a small, dim thing, the magical equivalent of an ember rather than a fire, its edges irregular where his own magic had been doing its slow, patient work. Mara was quiet for nearly 2 minutes. Then she opened her eyes and released his hands and said, 25%. I was generous at 30. She looked at him with those sharp, considering eyes. Your capacity is exceptional. Genuinely exceptional. Beyond what I expected at this stage. Is that good? Harry said. It depends what you do with it, she said. Which is always the answer to that question. She picked up her tea. There is one more thing we need to discuss. The possession attempt, Harry said. Mara looked at him. You've been anticipating this. Quirrell is being used by what's left of Voldemort, Harry said. Voldemort wants what's in the vault, or what he thinks is in the vault. The stone is the story Dumbledore has been running to keep him occupied, but eventually he'll either get past the protections or he'll try a different approach. If the fragment in me is a connection point, then close proximity to Voldemort, especially if he tries to use it, is going to produce a reaction. An explosive one, Mara said. Good, Harry said. Selina said, quietly, Harry. He looked at her. She had her fingers around her teacup and she was looking at him with the expression she wore when she was about to say something that she'd been deciding whether to say for some time. This isn't a job, she said. I know, he said. A job has an exit, she said. A job has a plan that accounts for the failure states. This is a situation with a lot of moving parts, he said. I know, Selina. I'm not walking in blind. You're 15, she said. You were 17 when you started working the rooftops in Gotham, he said. You've told me. I wasn't carrying a fragment of the most dangerous dark wizard of the century inside me at 17, she said. I didn't choose to carry it, he said. And I'm choosing how to use the situation it's created. They looked at each other. The tea shop was warm and close around them and outside the December street was white with cold and somewhere in the village the third-year students were beginning to arrive for the official Hogsmeade trip, their voices carrying through the old glass. Selina said, very quietly, I need you to promise me you're going to be careful. I'm always careful, he said. You're always effective, she said. Those aren't the same thing. He held her gaze. He thought about the cupboard under the stairs and the shoes that didn't fit and the 2 sizes too large hand he'd taken on Privet Drive, and the 10 years since, and the particular quality of being known the way Selina knew him, not as a legend, not as a student, not as an asset, just as himself, the specific person she'd picked up in a dark hallway in Surrey. I'll be careful, he said. She looked at him for one more moment and then nodded, once, with the compressed finality of someone accepting a promise that they needed to trust. Mara said, show me the suppression. They worked for an hour and a half in the back of the tea shop, the proprietor, a compact woman in her 50s who had the particular quality of someone with an arrangement with people who needed private rooms, having retreated entirely to the front and provided more tea without being asked. The practical session was the most demanding work Harry had done in months, which was saying something given that Mara's training standards had never relaxed toward the comfortable end of the scale. She pushed him through the suppression technique 6 consecutive times, each time extending the duration and adding an active task to be conducted simultaneously, holding a redirected warmth charm, reading a text passage, and eventually conducting a short conversation while maintaining full suppression, which was the most difficult because conversation required executive function and suppression required the same cognitive band. By the 6th repetition he was sweating and the room had the particular quality of overlaid magical pressure that accumulated when someone did a lot of work in a small space. Again, Mara said. I've done it 6 times, Harry said. You'll do it 9, Mara said. Because the 7th will be when it feels normal, and the 8th will be when it feels easy, and the 9th will be when you know you can do it under pressure. That's not, he stopped, because she was right and he knew it and objecting to correct methodology on grounds of discomfort was not something he'd been trained to do. He took a breath. Fine, he said. Give me the active task. Conversation, she said. With Selina. About something that matters. He activated the suppression and looked at Selina. She was watching him from across the table with the assessing attention of someone monitoring the quality of the work while also being a genuine participant in what was being asked of him. "Tell me about Hermione," she said. He felt the suppression, the familiar held tension of it, and he said, "She's exceptional. She approaches magical theory the way you approach a building, systematically, with the exits already mapped. She's been doing independent architectural research on the castle since the second week without anyone asking her to. She read Mara's chapter 9 and found the missing vector independently. Do you trust her?" "I trust her judgment," he said. "And I trust that her ethics are real. They're not rules she's been given, they're conclusions she's reached. Those are harder to bend but they're also harder to break." "Is she your friend?" The suppression held, steady. "Yes," he said. "She and Ron both." "Ron Weasley," Selina said. "Tell me." "Straightforward," Harry said. "Genuinely straightforward, which is rarer than it sounds. He has a strategic mind that nobody's ever pointed at anything useful and he's loyal in the way of someone who has decided on a person and doesn't revisit the decision." A pause, maintaining suppression. "He makes me feel less calculated." Selina looked at him. "Less calculated how?" "I plan everything," Harry said. "I assess everything. Ron just exists, and finds things funny, and plays chess, and I find it restful." He caught the expression on Selina's face. "Don't say it." "I wasn't going to say anything," she said. "You were going to say it's good that I have people my age around." "I was going to say it's good that you have people who make you feel less calculated," she said. "That's a specific thing, Harry. That matters." He held the suppression and breathed and looked at the woman across the table from him who had picked him up in a dark hallway when he was 5 years old with shoes that didn't fit and had given him everything she had to give, which turned out to be considerably more than she'd known she was carrying. "9, Mara said. He dropped the suppression and felt the tension dissolve and sat for a moment with the particular depletion of sustained effort. "Good," Mara said, and she meant it in the specific way she used for things that were not just adequate but genuinely right. "The vault approach should take you under 4 minutes. You have margin." "The third layer," Harry said. "The dog. You want to assess the musical approach." "I want to assess whether you have a plan for the 4th and 5th layers even if Dumbledore removes them," Mara said. "If he removes them, I won't need a plan for them," Harry said. "Harry. I know." He pressed his hands flat on the table. "If he doesn't remove them, or if they've been modified since his assessment, the 4th layer." I couldn't fully read it from the 3rd layer door but the signature was complex. Dense. Something logic-based, possibly, given the feel of the construction, systematic rather than brute force. "Logic puzzle," Selina said. Harry glanced at her. "Possibly. Hermione has noted that certain sections of the sub-basement corridor show the magical signature of a containment system rather than a direct barrier, something that requires solving rather than breaking." "And the 5th? "Dumbledore's personal magic," Harry said. "If he hasn't removed it, I'll need to either absorb it or find the gap. His personal signature is strong but I've had a month of ambient exposure. I could work with it." He paused. "But it won't come to that. He'll remove them." "You're trusting him," Mara said. "I'm trusting that he understood the conversation we had," Harry said. "There's a difference." Mara looked at him steadily. Then she nodded. It was not the nod of someone satisfied but the nod of someone who had completed their assessment and was moving on. "Then you're ready," she said. "When will you go?" "Before Christmas," Harry said. "Quirrell is escalating. He tried the vault on Halloween and failed but he's not going to wait indefinitely. Whatever's driving him is getting impatient. I'd rather go before he does something that changes the situation." "This week," Selina said. "This week," Harry agreed. Mara reached across the table and put her hand briefly on his forearm, which was the maximum physical expression of sentiment she deployed. It was, from her, the equivalent of what most people communicated with a long embrace. "You are the finest student I have taught," she said, with the directness of someone who didn't say things they didn't mean. "And I have taught remarkable people." Harry looked at her. He thought about the Prague kitchen and the fourth-floor room and 6 years of the most rigorous, demanding, exacting education anyone had given him. He thought about the first time he'd drawn magic from a charged object and yelped and dropped it, and she'd said again with the calm of someone for whom adequate was not a stopping point. "Thank you," he said. "For all of it." She looked at him for a moment with those dark, sharp eyes. Then she released his arm and picked up her tea. "Don't thank me," she said. "Go get what's yours." He was back inside the castle by noon, before the official Hogsmeade crowd returned, and he found Hermione and Ron in the library, Ron playing himself at chess, which was a sign of boredom reaching operational levels, and Hermione cross-referencing 2 books simultaneously with the focused intensity of someone chasing something specific. Hermione looked up when he came in. She took one look at his face and said, "What happened?" "I met with Mara," he said. "And?" "Several things." He sat down and kept his voice low. "The situation with what I'm carrying, is more complex than I knew but less dangerous than it might be. She ran practical training this morning. And I've confirmed the vault timeline." "This week," Hermione said. He looked at her. "You've had your this week phase since Monday," she said. "I've been watching." Ron, without looking up from his chess, "To be fair, I thought it was more of a very soon face." "It's the same face," Hermione said. "This week," Harry confirmed. "Wednesday night, if Dumbledore has done what he said he'd do. I'll confirm on Tuesday." Hermione closed both her books with the decisive sound of someone who had been waiting for a specific conversation to arrive and was now organized for it. "Tell me exactly what each layer is," she said. "Everything you know." He told her. All of it, the mechanical lock, the detection suppression, Fluffy, the potential logic puzzle on the 4th layer, Dumbledore's personal magic on the 5th. She listened with the complete attention she gave everything that mattered, occasionally asking a precise question, occasionally writing something in the margin of her notes. When he finished she said, "The logic puzzle. If it's what I think it is, there's a reference in Potions, Principle and Practice, 6th edition, to a defensive application of potion-based logic barriers. 7 bottles, different properties, a riddle for navigating them. Snape uses it in his advanced research as a methodological reference point." She opened the book she'd been reading and turned to a marked page. "Here." Harry looked. The passage described a barrier configuration using 7 different potions, forward, backward, neutral, and a verse riddle encoding the solution. "You think Snape set this? The magical signature you described as logic-based, systematic rather than brute force," Hermione said. "That matches Snape's approach to everything. He doesn't do blunt. He does precise. If I know the riddle structure, I can work out the solution before I'm inside it," Harry said. "You won't need to," Hermione said. She turned the book further and tapped a passage. The 7th edition update to this configuration includes the correction to a logic error in the original riddle structure. The corrected version follows a specific deductive sequence. If I work through the likely bottle configuration, she was already writing, her quill moving with the quick efficiency of someone who thought faster than most people talked, "I can give you the answer before you go in." Ron looked up from his chess. "You're going to solve Snape's puzzle from a library book." "I'm going to solve the archetype of Snape's puzzle from its primary source," Hermione said. "There's a distinction." "There really isn't," Ron said, with warm admiration. She worked through it in 20 minutes, which Harry timed. The solution was, she was right, deductively determinable from the structure of the riddle and the properties of the potions listed in the reference. She wrote it on a separate sheet and handed it to him. "Second from the left going forward," she said. "Third from the right going back." He looked at the sheet and then at her. How confident are you? If Snape used the standard configuration from this source, she said, completely. And if he modified it? Then you'll have to read the riddle itself when you're in there, she said. Which you can do. Harry folded the sheet and put it in his notebook. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me, she said. She stopped. He waited. Come back, she said, in the voice of someone being more direct than they'd planned to be. Ron, very deliberately, did not look up from his chess. I will, Harry said, which was not a sentiment he'd have offered to most people because he'd been trained to be accurate about promises, and promises about outcomes depended on variables he couldn't fully control. But he looked at Hermione across the library table and thought that she, of all people, would not need the sentiment to be false comfort. She needed it to be true. So he made sure it was. Right, she said. Good. Tuesday confirmed it. He went to Dumbledore's office, directly, knocking, the way you approached a conversation you were entitled to rather than requesting entry like a supplicant, and McGonagall, who appeared to act as the headmaster's informal gatekeeper, looked at him with the considering expression she'd been giving him since he arrived, the look of someone recalibrating a category. I need 5 minutes with the headmaster, Harry said. McGonagall looked at him for a moment. Then she said, he's expecting you, and stepped aside, which told Harry that Dumbledore had either been watching for him or had made an accurate prediction about his timeline. Probably both. Dumbledore's office was exactly as layered and interesting as Harry had expected, the instruments, the portraits of previous headmasters who were watching Harry with a range of expressions from apprehensive to fascinated, Fawkes the Phoenix on his perch who regarded Harry with the uncomplicated interest of a creature that had its own relationship with time. Harry looked around the room with one sweep of attention and then looked at Dumbledore. The 4th and 5th layers, Harry said. Removed yesterday evening, Dumbledore said. You'll find the passage clear. And the detection charm? That's yours to manage, Dumbledore said. I won't remove it. The vault still has other contents that require protection, and I won't leave those unguarded on your account. Fair, Harry said. The 3rd layer, Fluffy? I'll have Hagrid take him out onto the grounds Wednesday evening, Dumbledore said. He'll be grateful for the walk. Harry nodded. Clean. Direct. The plan was functional. One more thing, he said. Yes. Quirrell, Harry said. I'm going in Wednesday. If he makes a move before Wednesday, I need to know. I'll know if he moves, Dumbledore said. That's not the same as me knowing, Harry said. Dumbledore looked at him for a moment. Then he reached into a drawer and produced a small, flat mirror, circular, palm-sized, unremarkable except for the faint warmth of an active enchantment. He held it out. If Quirrell moves toward the vault, this will alert you. Harry took it. He felt the enchantment, simple, responsive, Dumbledore's signature. Thank you, he said. Harry, Dumbledore said, as he was turning to go. Harry stopped. The shard, Dumbledore said. Mara spoke to me last night by mirror. She told me what she told you. Good, Harry said. Are you? Dumbledore paused in a way that was not his usual managed pause but something more genuine, an older man searching for a question that wouldn't come out wrong. Are you all right? Harry considered this with the honesty it deserved. Yes, he said. It changes things but it doesn't change things badly. I've been living with it for 15 years. Knowing what it is makes it easier, not harder. You are, Dumbledore said, quietly, remarkably well calibrated for someone your age. I had good teachers, Harry said. More than one, I gather. 3, Harry said. Counting you. He left the office and went down the stairs and through the castle with the settled focus of someone whose plan had resolved into its final, executable form. The variables were manageable. The timeline was clear. The team was as good as he could ask for. Wednesday night. The mirror woke him at 2 in the morning on Wednesday. It pulsed once, warm against his palm, and he was awake before it finished pulsing. He lay still for 3 seconds, cataloguing the dormitory, for other breathing patterns all deep and regular, Pick awake on her perch and watching him with steady amber eyes. Quirrell had moved. He got up and dressed in the dark with the practiced speed of someone who had done this many times. Dark clothes, his wand in his right pocket, the Hermione's folded solution sheet in his notebook. He looked at Pick. "Not tonight," he said, quietly. "I'll be back." Pick ruffled her feathers in a way that conveyed a complex opinion about this statement but did not object further. He went out of the dormitory and down the stairs and through the common room and into the castle, and the castle was dark and cold and deeply, specifically awake in the way it sometimes was at night, the enchantments not sleeping but watching, the portraits murmuring in their sleep, the building itself attending to things Harry couldn't see. He took the route to the dungeons without thinking about it, his feet knowing the path through weeks of repetition. Down to the section of wall. The stone, seamless, warm. He found the first tumbler. 3 minutes. The door opened. He activated the suppression and went in. The second layer was the detection charm in the staircase, and he held the suppression through it with the ease of someone who had done the technique 9 consecutive times this morning in a tea shop in Hogsmeade. The 7th time it had felt normal. The 8th, easy. The 9th, certain. He went down the stairs certain. The corridor at the bottom was empty and the door to the 3rd layer was open. Hagrid had taken Fluffy out. Harry went through the door into a large stone chamber, the smell of animal habitation, warm and heavy, 3 indentations in the straw where 3 heads had rested, a door in the far wall standing ajar. Through it came the faint sound of the 4th layer, or what had been the 4th layer, and was now nothing, Dumbledore's word kept. He went through. The 5th chamber was empty in the specific way of somewhere that had recently held something substantial, the absence was shaped, the way a room felt different after furniture had been removed. Dumbledore's 5th layer, gone. He dropped the suppression, for minutes and some, he had margin, and stood for a moment in the 5th chamber and let his senses reach outward. The vault was close. He could feel it the way he'd always been able to feel locked things, not the lock itself but the space it protected, the specific quality of something held in careful containment, the way a sealed jar has a different air pressure than an open one. There was someone already in the vault. He moved fast, not running, which made noise, but moving at the top of efficient, through the 5th chamber and into a short stone passage that ended at a heavy door that was not locked, was in fact hanging open, and through the open door was the vault itself. Small. Low-ceilinged. Flagstone floors, stone shelves, the smell of very old, very contained magic. And Quirrell, standing at the far shelf with his back to the door, his hand extended toward a row of objects, his posture the specific configuration of someone looking for something with desperate urgency. Harry stepped into the vault and closed the door behind him. Quirrell spun around. In the light of the vault's ambient enchantment glow, everything in here had a faint luminescence, the contained magic bleeding slightly through the containment. Quirrell's face was different from the classroom version. The stutter was gone, the nervous effect stripped away, the purple turban slightly loose. His eyes were quick and furious and frightened, and underneath the fright was the larger, colder thing that was using him. "Potter," Quirrell said. "You're looking for the stone," Harry said. "It's not here." Quirrell's eyes moved. "The stone is a misdirection," Harry said. "Dumbledore's been running it all year. The stone isn't under Hogwarts." He walked further into the vault, not toward Quirrell but to the right, along the left wall where the shelf held smaller objects, looking without looking in the way of someone who has already seen the map. "What's here is considerably more personal." "You shouldn't be here," Quirrell said. "Neither should you," Harry said pleasantly. And yet. He could feel the doubled presence very strongly now, the 2 things in one quality he tracked all year, except in the vault's concentrated magical atmosphere it was sharper than usual, the fragment in himself responding to the proximity like 2 magnets detecting each other. The remaining piece of Voldemort inside Harry was, for the first time, active, not dormant as it usually was but alert, oriented, pulling toward the larger concentration of Voldemort that was occupying Quirrell's body. Harry felt this and noted it and kept it from his face. "Stand aside," Quirrell said, and the voice had changed, not Quirrell's voice anymore, not exactly, something underneath it surfacing, older and colder and considerably more forceful. "I know what you are, boy. And I know what you carry." "I know what I carry too," Harry said. "Better than you do, probably." Quirrell, Voldemort, went still. The stillness of someone receiving information that required adjustment. "The steel magic," the thing said, through Quirrell's mouth. "You've been trained." "Quite thoroughly," Harry said. "Then you know that what you carry is mine," Voldemort said, and the voice was fully his now, Quirrell just the vehicle, and Harry looked at the face and the eyes had gone wrong, the red tinge behind the grey, the thing wearing a man like a coat. "Give it to me." "It's not yours anymore," Harry said. "It's been mine for 15 years. And there's considerably less of it than you remember." A pause. Then, in the voice of someone conducting an assessment, "What have you done to it?" "Nothing intentional," Harry said. "My magic did it on its own." "Which tells you something about what my magic thinks of yours, I suppose." The temperature in the vault changed. Not physically, the stone and the air stayed the same, but magically, the way it changed when someone with significant power decided to stop performing patience. Quirrell's arm came up, wand extended, and the spell he threw was fast and dark and Harry absorbed it. Not deflected. Absorbed. He reached out with both hands and the magic ran into his palms and through him and he held it, felt its structure, a binding curse, designed to immobilize, Voldemort's signature all through it, dark and ancient and angry. He held it for 2 full seconds and then returned it, modified, stripped of the binding and carrying instead the resonance of the fragment inside him, Voldemort's own energy, shaped by 15 years of Harry's system, transformed into something no longer recognizable as Voldemort's. Quirrell stumbled back against the shelf. Voldemort made a sound that was not through Quirrell's mouth but through the air of the vault directly, which was not a sound human vocal cords produced and was very unpleasant to hear. Yes, Harry said. The fragment, and now the voice had something in it that was not fury and not cold calculation but was, unmistakably, a specific kind of alarm. "What have you done to the, I told you," Harry said. "My magic has been working on it for 15 years. There's perhaps 20% of it left, at this point." He extended his awareness toward the fragment, found it, diminished, but alert now, pulled toward its source. He took hold of it the way he took hold of anything that needed redirecting. "Do you want it back?" He felt Voldemort reach for the connection through the fragment, the possessing impulse, the reaching through that he'd always felt as a distant, faint intrusion. In the vault, close and concentrated, it was not faint. It was direct. It hit the fragment and the fragment responded and Harry held both of them, the fragment and the connection, in the full attention of his steel magic and he squeezed. The vault went white. Not light exactly, the magical equivalent of light, an overload of concentrated energy releasing in a single moment that had no physical expression but which Harry felt from the top of his skull to the soles of his feet and which, he suspected, would be felt through the stone in every direction for some distance. Quirrell hit the wall. Not gently. He slid down it and sat on the vault floor and made a very small sound. His hands were at his face, palms pressing against his eyes, and the double quality was gone, just one thing in one body, just Quirrell, pale and shaking and looking at Harry with his own eyes in a way he hadn't all year. The fragment was gone. Not weakened, not reduced. Gone. The connection had tried to pull it back and the contact had been the final accelerant for a process that had been building since 1981, and the last 20% of Voldemort's soul fragment had dissolved in a burst of 15 years of steel magic and was gone. Harry felt the absence like a room he'd always been in suddenly having a wall removed. Not empty, lighter. Different. He stood in the vault and breathed. Quirrell looked at him from the floor with eyes that were, for the first time, just his own. "He's gone," he said, in the small, hollow voice of someone who has been a passenger in their own life for so long that autonomy felt foreign. "I can't feel him." "He's not gone," Harry said. "He lost his anchor here. He's still out there, somewhere. But not here." He looked at Quirrell with the clear, unflinching attention of someone who had done their assessment and reached a conclusion. "What did he promise you?" Quirrell made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Everything," he said. "Power. Knowledge. Greatness." He put his head back against the wall. "He was in Albania. I found him by accident. And then it wasn't accidental." "He found you," Harry said. "Yes," Quirrell said. Harry looked at him for a moment. At the man on the floor of a vault under a school, who had made terrible choices from a terrible starting point, who was now sitting in the wreckage of those choices looking at the 15-year-old boy who had just dissolved his master's foothold in the world. "Go to Dumbledore," Harry said. "Tonight. Everything you know about what he wanted, what he planned, where he's been. All of it. Dumbledore will want it, and it's the only thing that protects you." "Why are you?" Quirrell started. "Because you just became the most useful person in this vault," Harry said, "and I'd rather that usefulness go somewhere productive than wasted on self-pity." He turned to the shelf. "Now be quiet for a moment." He looked along the shelf. His eyes found it without effort, the vial, exactly as the mirror had shown him, small and glass and the color of his mother's eyes. It sat between two larger objects on the middle shelf as though it had always been there, as though it was simply being stored, as though it was any object and not the last traceable echo of a woman who had died at 21 saving the person currently standing in front of it. He picked it up. It was warm. Warmer than the shelf, warmer than the vault's air, active, still, the magic inside it not faded or degraded as he'd half feared but present. His mother's last spell, her last magical act, the protection she'd built and poured into him and the residue of which Dumbledore had caught and kept and studied for 15 years. He held it and felt it and let himself feel it, which was a choice, because feeling things was always a choice and he was usually careful about when he made it. The warmth of it moved up through his hand and arm and he stood in the vault with Quirrell against the wall and his mother's magic in his palm and he let himself feel the thing that the mirror had almost broken him open with. She had loved him. Completely. And the proof of it was still here, 15 years later, still warm. He closed his fingers around the vial and put it in his pocket. He looked at Quirrell. "Dumbledore," he said. "Now." Quirrell got to his feet with the uncertain movements of someone relearning physical autonomy. He looked at Harry with something that was complicated and probably had several years of unraveling ahead of it. "What you did," he said. "With the fragment. The absorbed spell, not important right now," Harry said. "It is," Quirrell said. He couldn't possess you. He tried. When you were small, he tried once and couldn't, and he stopped. That's why he never came to you directly. He couldn't possess a steel magic practitioner. The magic repels the possession attempt." Harry stood with this for a moment. Another piece of the picture sliding into place. "Good to know," he said. "Dumbledore." He went out of the vault and back through the empty chambers and up the stairs and through the stone door, and he stood in the dungeon corridor and let the stone seal behind him and he felt the vault's absence behind the wall, the detection charm still live, the first layer back in place, the space below quieter than it had been. He stood in the dark corridor and reached into his pocket and felt the warm glass of the vial. He breathed. Then he went upstairs. He did not go to Dumbledore. Not tonight. He went to the dormitory and lay on his bed and he held the vial and looked at the ceiling and thought about everything that had happened in the vault and what it meant and what came next and what he was going to say to Dumbledore in the morning, and he thought about Selina and Mara and what he was going to tell them, and he thought about Ron asleep 4 feet away with an unearned ease that Harry found, as always, quietly wonderful, and he thought about Hermione who had said come back in the library with the directness of someone being more honest than they'd planned. He fell asleep holding the vial. Warm, still warm, his mother's last spell asleep in his hand. The fragment was gone. The vault was empty of what it had taken. The connection to Voldemort, the one that had been a thread between them since Harry was 1 year old, was severed. He felt, lying in the dark of the Gryffindor dormitory with his mother's magic worm in his hand, lighter than he ever had. Different. Not incomplete, lighter. The removal of something that had been weight without his knowing it was weight until it was gone. He looked at the ceiling and he thought, Selina, I was careful. Mara, it worked. And then he closed his eyes and slept.